On February 9th, 2020, Sinn Féin, who is Ireland's oldest political party, shocked the political world by receiving the most votes in the Irish general election, only falling one seat short of Michael Martin's Fianna Fáil. 4 years later, the party would win the most votes in Northern Ireland during the British general election, something that they had accomplished only once before in 2010. Still, this was the first time the party held the majority of the votes throughout the island since 1918. In all, nearly 750,000 voters voted for Sinn Féin in these two elections combined. Even though Sinn Féin has seen quite a bit of electoral success recently over the past few decades, many still view the party as the political wing of the Irish Republican Army. But how has the party become so successful? In this video, we're going to look at the party's rise in the early 1900s, its near-death mid-century, and its political revival since the 1980s. Hi, my name is Dave, and welcome to Election History, where I talk about campaigns, elections, political parties, candidates, and so on. I have a master's degree in political science from McGill University and worked in politics for over 30 years. If this is the kind of content you like, please subscribe to the channel and like and share the video, as it really helps in the algorithm. If you would like to further support the channel, you can join my Patreon with the link in the description. Here is a list of my current Patreon members. Today's Patreon producer is Drew Landry. It's people like Drew and my Patreon members that make this channel possible. Now, on to today's video. This video is aimed to give you a deeper understanding of the history of Sinn Féin. By no means is this an exhaustive account of the history of the party. An entire channel could be based on that premise alone and probably never finish. However, this video will hopefully delve deeper into the subject compared to most videos on YouTube. Now, most people know Sinn Féin because it was the political wing of the Irish Republican Army during the Troubles. And while this is true, this video is primarily focused on the political activities of Sinn Féin and not the military operations that happened from the Easter Rising to today. I will admit that it will be hard to separate the military and paramilitary actions and events from the political events, but I'm going to try to do my best. Otherwise, this would just be a military video and not a political one. And I'm sure people are going to be mad at me because I'm not talking about specific paramilitary actions, either loyalist or Republican. And if you cannot accept that, well, thank you very much and bon voyage. And one final thing as well, I am not Irish and I am not an Irish speaker, so there will be some mispronunciations when it comes to certain names. Every time I tried to do the name, the only way it sounded right was doing it with an Irish accent, but then that came across as being kind of condescending and trying to mock people, so I decided to just go with the American accent, trying to do it the best way that I can. So any Irish people who want to comment on my pronunciation of certain names and places, please feel free to do so down in the comments below. Now, on to the video. So let's start with the birth of Sinn Féin, and that birth starts with Arthur Griffith. When Griffith started getting involved with Irish politics as a journalist, many Irish nationalist political movements were disorganized. There were those who were advocating for a violent overthrow of the British government, while others had advocated for a democratic approach. But the biggest voice of Irish self-governance in the early 1900s was the Irish Parliamentary Party, or the IPP. While in Parliament, the IPP supported the Liberal Party and usually gave the Liberals cover when it came to close votes at Westminster. The IPP, while instrumental in passing land reforms such as the Wyndham Land Act of 1903, was a party that had a number of factions who continued to fight amongst one another. One of the biggest problems for the IPP was its failure to bring home rule, or self-governance, to the people of Ireland. While there had been attempts made to give Ireland home rule, all of them had failed. Now, there are a lot of definitions as to what home rule could mean, but for this video, we're going to stick with the right of those living in Ireland to determine their own domestic affairs. One of those who was frustrated was Arthur Griffith, who basically said that the IPP's cooperation with the Liberal Party was a self-defeating prophecy and would never lead to any autonomy for Ireland. Griffith became increasingly vocal when it came to Irish nationalism, as well as dismantling the British Empire. In his newspaper, The United Irishman, Griffith would take strong stances against the British government, but usually supported democratic means to the British Empire's end. Realizing that the approach of the IPP appeasing to the Liberal government wasn't going anywhere, he knew that something more drastic needed to be done. In 1904, Griffith published The Resurrection of Hungary, in which he uses the model of the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867 as a potential model for Ireland. Without getting very deep into the Hungarian situation, the ruling Habsburgs of Austria, who controlled the Kingdom of Hungary, invited Hungarians to sit in the Imperial Council, the empire's legislature. However, the Hungarians abstained from sitting in the legislature, citing that sitting in the legislature would essentially be an acceptance of Austrian rule of Hungary. With the Austrians losing the Austro-Prussian War a year earlier and the Hungarians asking for greater autonomy, the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867 was reached. This compromise allowed Hungarians to control their own domestic affairs, while the empire would control foreign and military affairs. But back to Griffith's book, The Resurrection of Hungary, A Parallel for Ireland, which originally appeared in The United Irishman. I've put a link to the book in the description below. Between 1297 and 1800, Ireland had its own independent parliament that had quite a bit of autonomy. This level of autonomy was further expanded by the Constitution of 1782 and the Irish Appeals Act of 1783, which were introduced under the government of William Pitt the Younger, reducing Britain's influence in Ireland. And while the Lord Lieutenant served as the British Viceroy and the British monarch was still considered the head of state, the Irish Parliament had a great deal of say in the legislative and judicial process. However, Griffith felt that increased autonomy was part of Britain's master plan to incorporate Ireland into the eventual United Kingdom. Griffith contends that the only reason Pitt the Younger and the British government agreed to greater autonomy was because they knew they would not be able to withstand a rebellion in Ireland, since their army and navy were essentially worn thin by the war on the North American continent. He further states in his book that he feels that Pitt the Younger had absolutely no intention of abiding by the treaties which increased Irish autonomy. Griffith goes on to state that Pitt the Younger and the British government further stoked the flames of sectarianism, pitting Protestants against Catholics, which would create a division in Irish society, eventually leading to the Irish Rebellion of 1798. This gave the British government the opportunity to crush the rebellion, take over control of Ireland, abolish the Parliament, and establish the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland through the Act of Union 1800, which dissolved all autonomy within Ireland. With this, Griffith argued three main points. First, he argued that the Constitution of 1782, which gave greater autonomy to the Irish Parliament, was the true law for Ireland, and that the Act of Union 1800 was illegal since all legal decisions came from London. The second thing that Griffith advocated for was to proceed as the Hungarians did in the 1860s. He stated that members who were elected to the House and Commons in London should abstain from taking their seats, as it further legitimized the Act of 1800. This was a big problem that Griffith had with the Irish Parliamentary Party, as he saw them as simply placating to the British and failing to bring a Home Rule Bill to reality. Finally, he advocated for a dual monarchy such as that of Austria-Hungary. These ideas were the fundamental building blocks for the future political party, with the Hungarian policy now being known as the Sinn Féin policy. Now, when it came to organizing Irish nationalists, Griffith supported the idea of having individual organizations strengthen at the local level instead of creating a centralized Sinn Féin organization. He basically saw any organization as a propaganda machine instead of a political party. But still, the first organizational meeting to discuss the Sinn Féin policy was scheduled for November 28, 1905, at the Rotunda in Dublin. There were 5 chief preliminary members of the group: Arthur Griffith, Edward Martin, who funded the printing of the Resurrection of Hungary in book form; John Sweetman, a former Irish Parliamentary Party MP who had become disillusioned with the IPP; Thomas Martin, an architect who had been unsuccessful in forming his own nationalist clubs; and Walter L. Cole, a merchant and politician who would later become the founding director of the Sinn Féin printing press and publishing company. Another person who attended the conference was a young Patrick Pearse. The conference agreed on the principles of the Hungarian Plan as their roadmap to independence. They also voted to oppose all binding laws by the British government because those laws didn't have the consent of the Irish people, and that non-violence was the way to move forward. But the Sinn Féin policy wasn't just about Irish self-governance. The policy was a manifesto as to the problems in Ireland and how the British exacerbated those problems. The policy went into areas of education, industry and commerce, agriculture, the importance of the nation on the economy, and the opening of trade to other countries, all things that had been dictated by the British government. At the same time Sinn Féin was forming their political party, 2 men in Belfast were taking a more ambitious approach to removing British rule from Ireland: Bulmer Hobson and Denis McCulloch, who were also growing disillusioned with the slow progress of Irish independence, formed the Dungannon Club on March 8, 1905 in Belfast. Eventually, a number of clubs would form throughout the United Kingdom, including in London and Newcastle. Once the clubs became bigger and membership dues grew, the group hired an organizer to travel around the UK to advocate for the organization, and his name was Sean McDermott. Later in 1905, Hobson published Dungannon Club Manifesto to the whole of Ireland, which supported the idea of a passive resistance to achieve Irish independence. While many of the arguments that were made were similar to those of Griffith, Hobson made no mention of the Hungarian policy that Griffith had been writing so extensively about. Years later, Hobson said that Griffith wanted his teachings to be accepted as a whole. Basically, he was saying that Griffith was obsessed with his Hungarian approach to achieving Irish independence and closed-minded to any other possible pathways to independence. Now, before we continue, we need to talk about the difference between Republicans and nationalists. Republicans support the absolute removal of the British from Ireland, period. In today's context, many automatically associate Irish republicanism with violence. And while most of the violence that has taken place has been committed by Republicans, not all Republicans supported violence. On the other hand, nationalists were those who supported the idea of Irish autonomy with or without the British Crown. The current Social Democratic and Labour Party in Northern Ireland is a perfect example of an organization being nationalist. They support working with the British government in the current context, but their eventual goal is for Irish reunification, which would mean the end of British rule in Ireland. So when we talk about republicanism and nationalism, we will be doing so with these meanings. With Sinn Féin based in Dublin and the Dungannon clubs essentially having its strongest support in Belfast, this caused disagreements between the two groups. This also led to the two groups having different types of supporters. In Belfast, where Protestants dominated every aspect of life in Ulster, supporters of the Dungannon Club were more likely to support the Republican cause. In Sinn Féin, which was centralized and located in Dublin and more of an intellectual clique, nationalists were more likely to be attracted. But even with this being the case, in 1906, both of these organizations, along with Cumann na nGaedheal, I sure hope I'm pronouncing that right, essentially supported the same policies, but their ego-driven leaders and overlapping membership caused nightmares within the ranks of these organizations. Hobson would eventually become a member of Sinn Féin in 1906, but as history professor Richard Davis put it, he was shocked by the dismissive way Griffith and his supporters treated those who weren't regularly in Dublin. These attitudes further divided the organizations between Dubliners and non-Dubliners. Feeling shunned by Griffith and those in Dublin, Hobson wanted to drop the 1782 Irish Constitution as the roadmap for Ireland and go towards separation. Basically, he was talking about the Republican cause. His Belfast-based publication, Republic, was launched on December 13, 1906, in which the first editorial strongly supported republicanism by cutting all ties and opposing any compromises with England. The Belfast Dungannon Club, remember these were all individual clubs, overwhelmingly supported rejecting the policies of 1782. Whereas earlier in the year there was very little sunlight between the Belfast Dungannon Club and Sinn Féin, now there was starting to be a vast ocean. Even though the Belfast Dungannon Club made this drastic turn, the other Dungannon clubs had yet to do so. Patrick O'Hegarty, the secretary of the Dungannon Club in London and a member of Sinn Féin, invited Griffith to come to London to help keep all the organizations united. But Griffith, angered by the fact that Hobson had been invited to the United States to talk about Sinn Féin policy instead of him, decided not to go to London. When he returned to Dublin, he was scolded by the Sinn Féin National Council executive, of which he was a member, for taking an unauthorized trip to the United States to talk about Sinn Féin policy. This started a conflict between Griffith and Hobson, with O'Hegarty essentially being the moderator between the two men. Hobson's trip to the United States changed the way that Sinn Féin was viewed in the eyes of Irish Americans supporting Irish independence. Again, according to historian Richard Davis, Hobson's trip to the United States made many in Irish American circles see Hobson, rather than Griffith, as the leader of Sinn Féin. However, knowing that there were divisions not only between organizations but within Sinn Féin itself, American supporters insisted on unity before any financial aid was given to Sinn Féin. One organization that I have yet to talk about is the Irish Republican Brotherhood, or the IRB, which had an important role in 19th and early 20th century Irish history. In the early 1900s, the IRB was quite weak, like most other Republican organizations. But one of the goals of the Dungannon clubs was to both encourage young Irishmen to enlist in the IRB instead of the British Army, and to help bring American funds to the IRB. While Sinn Féin did have some connections to the Americas, the IRB had much stronger ones, spanning back decades. The goal of this recruitment and funding wasn't necessarily to start a war with the British, but to make the Irish cause stronger. Many current and former IRB members started being involved with the Dungannon clubs, with these members having very little appetite for Arthur Griffith's Hungarian-style compromise. It was an independent Irish republic at all cost. However, in April 1907, delegates from the Dungannon clubs and Cumann na nGaedheal decided to come together to form what they called the Sinn Féin League. This league supported, as they said, quote, the reigning of the sovereign independence of Ireland, end of quote, but didn't go as far as saying that negotiations weren't possible. The importance of this union was that the IRB was now squarely on the side of Hobson and not Griffith. This put the Sinn Féin National Council in a tough situation, as well as Griffith. As the Sinn Féin League grew and essentially rejected the Hungarian-style compromise that Griffith would cling on to regardless of what others thought, his place within the organization was in question. Rumblings were that Griffith could be replaced by the IRB loyalists, and that could essentially make Sinn Féin a political arm of the IRB. Yeah, this is what we could call foreshadowing, and man, there is a lot of foreshadowing going on here. But this wasn't to be, at least not yet. Charles Dolan, who was also a member of the IPP, converted to Sinn Féin after reading Griffith's Resurrection of Hungary. He resigned from the IPP and stood in a by-election as a Sinn Féin candidate to reclaim his seat in North Leitrim. This was the first time that a Sinn Féin candidate was placed on the ballot. Dolan's entry into the race led to all arguments being put aside, making Dolan's by-election a priority. Even though Dolan was a supporter of the Hungarian-style policy, both Hobson and Sean McDermott, who opposed Griffith's policies, went on to help Dolan in his campaign. However, a lot of the money that came from the United States to help Dolan was funneled through the Sinn Féin League instead of the Sinn Féin National Council, further solidifying the belief that Hobson's branch of Sinn Féin was deemed the legitimate branch by Irish Americans, such as John Devoy, the owner of the Gaelic American, who donated £100 to the Dolan campaign through Sinn Féin League. However, the president of the Sinn Féin League, P.T. Dáil, immediately sent a voice check to Griffith. Before the 1908 North Leitrim by-election was to take place, the third Sinn Féin convention was to take place in August of 1907. Even though there was unity when it came to Dolan's campaign, there was still a possibility for more divisions and Griffith being ousted from the party leadership. However, Dolan's campaign became the great uniter, with Dolan himself outlining his views on the future of Sinn Féin. With all in agreement, the Sinn Féin National Council and the Sinn Féin League merged into one Sinn Féin entity. What's interesting in this case is that Griffith, who could have possibly lost his position within the party, was now the victor. Dolan's defection to Sinn Féin lent credence to the popularity of the Hungarian Compromise policy. But according to Patrick O'Hegarty, there was a compromise. Sinn Féin would openly say that independence from the United Kingdom was their main goal, appealing to Republicans. However, if an opportunity to revisit the 1782 Irish Constitution was presented by the British, Sinn Féin would be open to negotiations. Still, Hobson also claimed victory, saying that he had outvoted Griffith in his own organization, though there is no evidence to support this claim, according to historian Richard Davis. Now, back to Dolan's by-election. Even though Dolan was the incumbent MP, his chances of winning the seat again were against him. Because he was running in a rural constituency, and much of rural Ireland relied on those in the Irish Parliamentary Party, he really didn't have a chance of winning. Still, Dolan, who had the opportunity to still hold his seat without resigning, thought that winning the seat would be easier because of the financial support coming from America, as well as his connection to his constituents. The campaign was extremely bitter, and Richard Davis's book, Arthur Griffith and Nonviolent Sinn Féin, does a great job of looking into the campaign. So if you are interested in the particulars of that campaign, I would highly recommend reading his book. It's in the description below. At the end of the day, Dolan lost to IPP candidate Francis Meehan. While it was a landslide victory, with Meehan winning 72.8% of the vote, it wasn't as big of a landslide as in the past. When Patrick McHugh ran for the seat in 1900, the last time it was contested, McHugh won 91.3% of the vote over Unionist Charles James Singleton. Therefore, there was nearly a 20% drop from the most recent contested election in this constituency. Sinn Féin, while losing, would spin this as a victory, as it had essentially split the nationalist vote. Still, the view of most in Sinn Féin was that this was a positive, as more money and members came into the organization. On top of the money coming in from the United States, there was now a Sinn Féin League of America started in Buffalo. Everything was looking positive for the party. However, things were going to change. Edward Martin, one of the original members of Sinn Féin and a large financial backer, resigned from the party as he bitterly opposed contesting the North Leitrim by-election. Charles Dolan would eventually immigrate to the United States, where he settled and stayed in St. Louis, as I mentioned earlier. Other founding members of the party would also become less active. Another thing to remember is that even though both organizations merged and supported Dolan's election, there were still divisions in Sinn Féin. Not all members automatically accepted Griffith's Hungarian Compromise. Many who were members of the Irish Republican Brotherhood still supported a Republican approach, advocating for a fully independent Ireland with no exceptions. In March of 1909, a group of parliamentarians called the All for Ireland League, led by William O'Brien, approached Griffith to seek a compromise and possibly create an electoral alliance between the two groups, providing voters with a moderate choice. O'Brien saw two groups as the extremist in Ireland. One group was the Unionist, and the other group was the sectarian Ancient Order of Hibernians, who were staunchly Catholic. O'Brien saw Sinn Féin as more moderate, and particularly Griffith himself, since he wasn't a full-blown Republican. He and Griffith did agree on many of the things, but their support for abstentionism was a deal-breaker for the parliamentarians, and the Electoral Alliance never materialized. Still, on December 20th, 1909, the Sinn Féin executive met to discuss the possibility of reconsidering their abstentionist plank. The reason for this was because an election was likely to be triggered as a result of the House of Lords rejecting the Liberals' budget in Westminster. Knowing that Sinn Féin could have significant influence in any possible Home Rule bill if the Irish nationalists were to have the balance of power, the question was raised as to whether Sinn Féin should support the Irish MP election bids, which in turn would be a soft endorsement against their own abstentionist beliefs. However, the party voted against supporting the MPs, even those who had advocated against abstentionism. Both of the elections in 1910 saw the Liberal Party failing to get a majority, with the Irish MPs making up the balance of power. This would eventually lead to the Third Home Rule Bill. But things would get worse in 1910. Letters and notes from the Sinn Féin Executive Committee, as well as personal letters between Sinn Féin members and parliamentarians, were published in pro-Hobson publications. The party became more of an instrument of infighting than productive policy. Members were leaving the party, as well as money. Its 1910 convention had a poor attendance, and John Sweetman, who was elected president of Sinn Féin, wasn't even in attendance. He would later send a letter to Sinn Féin apologizing that he could not continue as president, which led to the vice president, Arthur Griffith, becoming president. Yes, even though Griffith was considered the founder of Sinn Féin in 1905, he wouldn't become its president until 1911, 6 years later. As for Hobson, who had been in the executive in some form or another, was not re-elected to Sinn Féin. As a result, he spent his time working on his publication, Irish Freedom, which was essentially controlled by the IRB, strongly Republican and anti-Griffith. Many of the people that Hobson brought into Sinn Féin left with him, making Sinn Féin weaker. Now the nationalist movement was in the same position it was back in 1906, a group of uncoordinated organizations throughout Ireland with different goals. But for Sinn Féin, they focused on rebuilding their organization in Dublin and building their base of support there. Sinn Féin were able to organize protests in Dublin, many of which actually drew large crowds. While the party might not have been in the position it was after the by-election, it wasn't quite dead yet. The party mostly focused on public relations, with Sinn Féin writer Seamus McManus actually being granted an interview with American President William Howard Taft. Sinn Féin was being seen more as an intellectualist nationalist movement through its publications instead of a political organization. As I mentioned before, the Liberals won the 1910 election, with the Irish MPs controlling the balance of power. This would lead to the Third Home Rule Bill being introduced. Griffith argued that John Redmond, who was leader of the IPP at Westminster, was giving up more and more to the British government. However, it wasn't just Sinn Féin that was worried. Nearly 500,000 Unionists, led by Sir Edward Carson, signed the Ulster Covenant, which opposed the Home Rule Bill. Additionally, the Unionists created the Ulster Volunteers, which recruited around 100,000 men to serve as a militia for the Unionist cause. As a response to the Ulster Volunteers, the Irish Volunteers were formed in 1913. Fun fact, Edward Carson was born at 4 Harcourt Street in Dublin in 1854. That was literally next door to where Sinn Féin had their headquarters in 1913. Yes, it is a small world, or at least a small Ireland. Now, back to the story. When World War I broke out a few months later, there was a split in the Irish volunteer movement. John Redmond argued that Irish volunteers fighting on behalf of the British Crown would improve the chances of Home Rule becoming a reality. Others, mostly stalwart Republicans, opposed Redmond's view. I only mention this because those who did the fighting alongside the British were erroneously referred to as Sinn Féin volunteers. As a matter of fact, Sinn Féin wasn't even officially represented in the Volunteers' December 1913 meeting, and Griffith was not in attendance. While Griffith opposed Redmond's proposals, neither he nor Sinn Féin were directly involved in the Irish volunteer movement. This won't be the only time that Sinn Féin was mislabeled in such a manner. For many in the Irish Republican movement, which included many of the Irish volunteers who stayed in Ireland after the split in the Irish volunteers regarding World War I, this was the time to strike. The Irish Republican Brotherhood decided to set up a military council in 1915, and at the end of 1915, their plan was to start an uprising and proclaim the Irish Republic during Easter of 1916. Before we start looking at Sinn Féin at the time of the Easter Rising, there is one thing that I would like to make clear. Many people misidentify nationalism and republicanism with Catholicism and unionism with Protestantism. And while it is true that religion usually falls along these lines, there were Protestants who were Republicans and nationalists, as well as Catholics who were Unionists. So to treat conflicts in 20th century Ireland as a pure sectarian conflict would be extremely wrong. Now, back to the Easter Rising. On April 24th, 1916, members of the Irish Republican Brotherhood and Irish Volunteers charged into the General Post Office, or GPO, in Dublin. They posted the proclamation of the Irish Republic and fought against the British Army from the GPO until April 29th, when the Irish Republicans surrendered. Many in Ireland didn't support the uprising, mostly because it was considered a nuisance. More civilians were killed and wounded than actual soldiers in the conflict. Essentially, people would be killed by a stray bullet on their way back from the store. Therefore, the rising wasn't really popular in Ireland as people weren't expecting an insurrection. It just basically popped out of nowhere. Also, many in Ireland thought that the leaders of the rebellion should be punished since they caused so much harm to the community as a whole. In fact, some people within Ireland called those that were in the GPO murderers and starvers of the people. But when the British government decided that these insurrectionists should be executed for their insurrection, many in Ireland thought that that punishment was too extreme. Once the executions were carried out, as well as the institution of martial law, public opinion swung strongly in favor of those who had proclaimed the Irish Republic. Now, those who were considered a nuisance previously were now deemed heroes by the Irish public. John Dillon, an Irish MP and member of the Irish Parliamentary Party, wrote to the party's leader, John Redmond, that a cult-like status had been created around the executed men of the Rising, with the relatives of the dead leaving churches and being greeted by loud cheers and vast parades commemorating those who had died. Regarding the situation in Dublin and the rest of the country, Dillon said, quote, "The temper of the country is extremely bad, and the temper of this city is ferocious." End quote. Now, even though this is a major event in Irish history, this is really all I'm going to talk about regarding the 1916 Rising. As I mentioned at the start of this video, this is about Sinn Féin and not about the military or paramilitary activities at this time. The reason I'm not going to really talk about the actual rising is that Sinn Féin wasn't really involved with the rising. Yes, the party helped the Irish Republican Brotherhood print out some pamphlets, but that was basically the extent of their involvement. Of those who were executed, only two, Sean McDermott and Eamon Cant, had any real involvement with Sinn Féin, and they had already resigned from the party before the rising. Constance Markovitz, who was also involved with the rising, was an executive member of Sinn Féin, but said that the only reason that she was a member of Sinn Féin was because it was the only organization which allowed women to join. Arthur Griffith, who found out about the revolt on the Saturday before, hoped that a revolt would be prevented. However, after the rising had begun, Griffith asked if he could join the volunteers at the GPO. According to historian Francis Stewart Leland Lyons, that's a long name, those in the GPO told Griffith that he should not be involved as his propaganda services in the future would be of greater value. Therefore, Sinn Féin's actual involvement in the rising was extremely minimal at best. But, as I mentioned in the previous chapter, those Irish volunteers who stayed in Ireland after the outbreak of World War II were referred to as the Sinn Féin volunteers, even though an overwhelming majority of those in the General Post Office were not, or never had been, members of Sinn Féin. Professor Lyons suggests that, quote, many Irish as well as British observers probably derived from the simple fact that whereas the secret springs of the insurrection were known to hardly anyone, the name Sinn Féin as an open separatist movement had been familiar for at least a decade, end of quote. It also appears that British intelligence on Ireland was quite bad, as they seemed quite confused as to who the main players were in Ireland. To be fair, most of the people in Ireland, as well as the nationalist and Republican organizations themselves, probably had a hard time identifying any leaders. This resulted in the rising being referred to as the Sinn Féin Rising, even if that was a completely inaccurate labeling. Still, even though he had not been involved in the rising, Arthur Griffith would be arrested but released toward the end of 1916. At the same time Griffith was released, others actually involved with the rising who had not been considered major players were also released. The importance of these late 1916 releases, as Professor Lyons says, was that, quote, the organization which had prepared the way and provided the striking force for Easter week had not been destroyed then or after. They had been merely driven underground and waited for a favorable opportunity to reappear, end of quote. This held true for both Sinn Féin and the Irish Republican Brotherhood, as new leadership quickly emerged less than a year later. With the rising over, the imposing of martial law, the popularity of those involved in the rising, and the release of those people a few months later, the question was now asked whether the culmination of all of these events could lead to a greater or constructive political purpose. The mislabeling of the rising as the Sinn Féin Rising actually was a blessing in disguise. Arthur Griffith got back to writing once he was released from prison and continued to speak about the independence of Ireland after World War I. But at the end of the day, the words Sinn Féin were now connected to the rising, which was now very popular and could make the name political gold. Luckily for Sinn Féin, the answer would come soon enough. James Joseph O'Kelly, an Irish Parliamentary Party Member of Parliament, passed away on December 22, 1916. O'Kelly had been unopposed in the last 3 elections. Count Plunkett, who was the father of Joseph Plunkett, one of the 16 who had been executed during the Rising by the British, ran in the by-election in O'Kelly's seat in North Roscommon. Contrary to popular belief, Plunkett didn't run as a Sinn Féin candidate, but actually ran as an independent. Still, he was supported by Sinn Féin and pledged to abstain from taking his seat if elected to the House of Commons. On February 2, 1917, Plunkett won the by-election with 58% of the vote and abstained from taking his seat in Westminster, though, according to Lyons, he reluctantly did so. A few months later, another Irish Parliamentary Party MP, John Phillips, also passed away, leading to another by-election. This time the candidate was Joseph McGuinness, who was a prisoner still being held for his role in the 1916 Easter Uprising. McGuinness didn't want to run for the position, but Michael Collins wanted him to. However, Collins needed to persuade Arthur Griffith to put his name on the ballot, which he eventually did. As someone who sought independence through peaceful means, Griffith was reluctant to put one of the living leaders of the Easter Rising on the ballot, representing the political party he tried so hard to build. This would truly be the first time that we see the merger of political and paramilitary in Sinn Féin. One of those who were opposed to McGuinness running was Eamon de Valera, who was also still in prison. De Valera stated that he felt that an electoral loss could hurt the movement. This was also one of the first political disagreements that we would see between de Valera and Collins, which is kind of coming attractions for what is ahead. As for the Irish Parliamentary Party, they essentially saw this as their Alamo. John Dillon, who I mentioned earlier, was a bigwig in the IPP and personally took charge of the campaign of their candidate, Patrick McKenna. During the campaign, Dillon wrote to John Redmond, quote, "We have the bishop, the great majority of the priests and the mob, and 4/5 of the traders of Longford. And if in the face of that we are beaten, I do not see how we can hope to hold the party in existence." End of quote. And yet the IPP lost the election by 37 votes on May 9th, 1917. This win and the continued pressure by the Irish public led to the Easter Rising prisoners being released in June of that year, including De Valera. As De Valera and his colleagues were being released, another death befell the Irish Parliamentary Party. Willie Redmond, the younger brother of party leader John Redmond and MP for East Clare, had been killed in Belgium while serving the British Army. This time, De Valera, who rose to prominence as one of the only living leaders of the Easter Rising, contested the election under the Sinn Féin banner. De Valera easily defeated his opponent, Patrick Lynch, by 71% of the vote. Interestingly enough, Lynch would eventually join Sinn Féin the next year and would eventually serve as De Valera's Attorney General when De Valera was Taoiseach between 1936 and 1940. This was now 3 defeats in a row for the Irish Parliamentary Party, and pretty significant defeats at that. These losses for the IPP indicated a shift away from nationalism and toward republicanism. While campaigning, De Valera didn't hide the fact that he was fighting for the same ends that Patrick Pearse was fighting for, which was an independent Irish republic completely removed of British control. In the eyes of IPP members, they also saw this as a possible move away from Home Rule to a pure Irish republic. Another problem for those who supported Home Rule was that the Unionists in Ulster were also opposed to leaving. The IPP felt that their days were numbered. But even with the success, Sinn Féin had their own problems. Count Plunkett, thinking that he was somehow the leader of Sinn Féin, called a convention known as the Plunkett Convention in April of 1917 to talk about the future of the party. While Plunkett called for a stronger connection between Sinn Féin, the IRB, and the Irish Volunteers, he also started his own groups called Liberty Leagues, which would create local branches similar to the Dungannon groups that had been created 12 years earlier. These clubs were basically a way for Plunkett to solidify support at the local level and be seen as the true leader of Sinn Féin. Still, these Liberty League organizations didn't do as well as Plunkett thought they would. Because of the mislabeling of the Sinn Féin uprising, the party, which was still led by Arthur Griffith, started their own Sinn Féin clubs, which saw the lion's share of new members. By early June, the concept of the Liberty League was abandoned, only lasting less than 2 months. Also after this convention, Cahill Broha, who was one of the Rising's top officers who escaped the firing squad, convened a meeting at his home. But this meeting, which included Arthur Griffith, Michael Collins, Rory O'Connor, and other members of a Republican group called the Mansion House Committee, Broha demanded the handing over of Sinn Féin to the Irish Volunteers, which included members of the IRB. In the end, Griffith accepted the terms which would make Sinn Féin support the Rising's Republican proclamation from 1916. At the Ardèche in October, Sinn Féin officially changed its stance, moving away from having a dual monarchy to supporting a fully independent Irish republic. This is also the moment when paramilitarism and the Sinn Féin political movement were joined at the hip. The period between April and July of 1917 was significant. Plunkett and Griffith started their rivalry, McGuinness was elected as an MP, the Easter Rising prisoners were released from jail, Sinn Féin had adopted republicanism, and Eamon de Valera was also elected as an MP. Sure, Sinn Féin benefited from the mislabeling of the party's connection to the Easter Rising, which helped Griffith at first. But as those connected to the Rising were released from prison, they too became members of Sinn Féin. Remember, Griffith, as well as Sinn Féin, used to be a nationalist party, which means they would consider negotiating with the British for some other arrangement besides a completely independent Irish republic. The new members entering the party were strong supporters of an independent Irish Republic. The party was losing its Hungarian Compromise image and gaining the image of the party being the party of the 1960 Easter Rising. These two differing opinions would come to a head during the Ardèche, or convention, for Sinn Féin in October of 1917. When the executive met, which was before the general seating of the convention, fierce debate already broke out regarding the direction of the party. Cathal Brogha supported a complete proclamation of the Irish Republic, similar to what had been fought for at the General Post Office a year and a half earlier. Arthur Griffith was on the other side, fighting for the same policies that he had advocated for over the last 12 years. When it looked like the executive might be at a stalemate, Eamon de Valera came up with a compromise which stated that, quote, Sinn Féin aims at securing the international recognition of Ireland as an independent Irish republic. Having achieved that status, the Irish people may, by referendum, freely choose their own form of government. End of quote. This wording seems to have appeased both sides, and the Ardèche moved forward. When the full Ardèche met on October 25th, things were relatively calm. However, the biggest point of contention was the election of a new president. The incumbent president, Arthur Griffith, ran for the position. His most recent and fierce rival, Count Plunkett, was also seeking the office. The third candidate to run was Eamon de Valera. There was also worry among the attendees that if either Griffith or Plunkett won, then there would be divisions amongst the people in the party. If Griffith won, many who supported the Republican cause would abandon the party. If Plunkett won, he and Griffith would continue their petty rivalry, which would account to nothing. De Valera seemed to not only be a uniter between Republicans and non-Republicans, as well as those who supported violent and non-violent means, but also a level-headed individual that would not let personal animosities get in the way of moving the party forward. De Valera was elected president, with both Griffith and Plunkett dropping out of the race and supporting De Valera. Another thing that this Ardèche did was to provide a smoother coordination between Sinn Féin, the IRB, and the Irish Volunteers, something that had never existed before. Even though Sinn Féin was now more organized, the Irish Parliamentary Party went on to win the next three by-elections, with one of those being to replace IPP leader John Redmond, who had passed away on March 6, 1918. While this worried Sinn Féin a little, the loss of Redmond, who was replaced by a son in Parliament, might have been a big blow. But, as historian Lyons said, quote, the government came in to rescue its opponents, end of quote. In March of 1918, when the Germans were pushing forward in Europe, the British government was considering whether to extend conscription to Ireland. Had the British done this when the war broke out, which would have also been before the Easter Rising of 1916, it might not have had that much of an impact. But as this was going through the war and Ireland was going through a revolutionary renaissance, this was a bad idea. John Dillon, who had now become the leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party, replacing John Redmond, warned British Prime Minister Lloyd George, quote, all Ireland will rise against you, end of quote, as the latter indicated that conscription would also be tied to any Home Rule bill. On April 16, 1918, the House of Commons voted for conscription to be expanded to Ireland. The sitting IPP and other nationalist MPs at Westminster walked out of Parliament and returned to Ireland. There they found common cause with Sinn Féin and decided to work together. Professor Lyons stated, quote, almost overnight, the most massive demonstration of nationalist solidarity that had been seen since the beginning of the war took place, end of quote. Political and religious leaders on April 18th met at the Mansion House in Dublin to create a pledge not to obey the Conscription Act, which was very popular throughout Ireland. However, the unity was to be broken. Yet another Irish Parliamentary Party MP died, this time 96-year-old Samuel Young from East Cavan. The by-election for the seat was to be held on June 20th, 1918. Arthur Griffith was the candidate for Sinn Féin. As candidate, Griffith stated that if there were to be continued cooperation between Sinn Féin and the IPP regarding the issue of conscription and policy toward the United Kingdom, the IPP had to support the idea of a complete independent Ireland, as well as supporting abstentionism at Westminster. The IPP refused, with John Dillon calling Griffith's policy lunacy, and fielded their own candidate. The election was expected to be close, however, the British government came in to save the day yet again for Sinn Féin. The British government wanted to crack down on those in Ireland who had advocated for resistance against conscription, and particularly those within Sinn Féin. The way that the government went about this was something called the German plot, where Sinn Féin leaders were accused of working with the German government to bring arms to Ireland for another uprising. Now, I don't use the word conspiracy here because there is debate as to whether this was one or not. Some contend that these were purely false charges to put Sinn Féin members in jail, thus the British government knew these claims to be false. Others contend that the British acted on bad intelligence, which, as we mentioned earlier with calling the Easter Rising the Sinn Féin Rising, not at all out of the realm of possibility. Therefore, I'm not going to call it a conspiracy or not. On May 17th, almost the entire leadership of Sinn Féin was arrested, with the noticeable exceptions of Michael Collins, Cathal Brogha, and Father Michael O'Flanagan, one of the vice presidents of Sinn Féin along with Griffith. However, many of the Sinn Féin leaders who would be arrested had been informed prior to the arrest, but decided to go through with it because being arrested might actually help in the East Cavan by-election. And it did, with Griffith winning 59.5% of the vote in a seat that had been safe for the Irish Parliamentary Party in previous elections. With these by-election victories, Sinn Féin was no longer considered an outsider political group as they were when Charles Dolan ran for Sinn Féin 10 years before. Now they were winning more elections than they were losing. Still, the British government stepped up their arrest of Sinn Féin leaders, with many leaders going underground. These underground leaders still pumped out publications and let people know about Sinn Féin and their resistance against conscription. But as World War I ended and the armistice was signed, Sinn Féin leaders still remained in jail. This gave Sinn Féin the best of all worlds. They had their underground network, which was still very active. Their jailed leaders continued to be seen as British oppression of the Irish, as most people thought that the German plot was untrue anyway, and the martyrs who died in the 1960 Rising were nearly revered as saints. With the end of the war, a new election was called. The election in December of 1918 was the first British general election in 8 years. In that time, Sinn Féin saw a momentous shift in their name recognition, membership, and financial support. Another thing to remember is that the electorate had expanded greatly. Now, women over 30 could vote, as well as all men 21 and older. Many of these new voters were likely to support Sinn Féin. On top of that, many Irish Parliamentary Party voters from 1910, who were usually older, had died over the last 8 years. Therefore, a Sinn Féin win in Ireland seemed totally possible. When it came to the campaign itself, it was hard fought, but Sinn Féin basically stuck to the same policies as before: complete independence from the British Crown and abstentionism. The only thing that was added to their manifesto, but that had been talked about in the past, was that Ireland should have representation in the post-war peace talks, with the independence of Ireland being on the table. Since American President Woodrow Wilson had talked about how even the smallest of nations should have the right to self-govern back in 1916, many in the Irish nationalist and Republican movements thought that the post-war negotiations would be the best time to move forward. Another thing to note is that Sinn Féin negotiated with the Labour Party, in which the latter would not contest seats in Ireland. There were a few independent Labour candidates running, but the main party stayed out. Out of the 105 seats to be contested, Sinn Féin fielded candidates in 102 of them, while the Irish Parliamentary Party only fielded 57 candidates. This left many Sinn Féin candidates being unopposed. On election day, Sinn Féin won 46.9% of the vote and 73 seats. The IPP was cut exactly in half to 21.7% of the vote. They lost 68 seats, with party leader John Dillon losing his own seat in East Mayo to none other than Eamon de Valera. De Valera won 66.5% of the vote to Dillon's 33.5%. The Unionists also lost 3.3% of the vote, but gained 5 seats in the process and were now at 22 seats. Sinn Féin, true to their word, abstained from sitting in Westminster, but not only did they abstain, but created their own parliament. On January 7, 1919, members of Sinn Féin met and decided to invite all elected members, regardless of party, to join the new Irish Parliament on January 21st, which was to be called the First Dáil. Of course, Unionists didn't attend, but the same held true for the Irish parliamentary members. Therefore, only Sinn Féin members were the members of the First Dáil. This First Dáil set up the government, created their own Declaration of Independence, and proclaimed that the government had been established on Easter Monday, 1916. The Dáil also stated that a state of war now existed between Ireland and England, and the Irish Volunteers were to be renamed the Irish Republican Army. De Valera, Griffith, and Plunkett were appointed delegates to any peace conference to be held if they were invited. Also, the political prisoners that were rounded up earlier had now been released, mostly due to the influenza that spread during 1919. But before we continue, I want to talk about the first, second, and third Dáil, which we will be mentioning throughout this video. Yes, I know this breaks the timeline of the video a little bit, but it can get confusing later on. The first Dáil is what I just mentioned, those elected in the 1918 Westminster elections who formed what they considered to be the first Irish Republic, which was a united, non-partitioned island. The second Dáil were those who were elected in the Irish elections of 1921 as a result of the Government of Ireland Act 1920, which did have a partitioned Ireland, but gave all of Ireland limited self-rule and did not require allegiance to the British Crown. Many Irish Republicans consider this second Dáil the last legitimate government of Ireland. The third Dáil was a result of the Anglo-Irish Treaty after the Irish War of Independence, which created a hard partition of Ireland, with Northern Ireland being part of the United Kingdom and Southern Ireland having a British-imposed devolved government, which required allegiance to the British Crown. This is the reason why Republicans do not consider the third Dáil as a legitimate government. And throughout the history of Sinn Féin, the party considered itself as the successors of either the first or the second Dáil, thus the legitimate government of Ireland. You will be hearing a lot about the first and the second Dáil throughout this video, so I just wanted to point that out, and you might just want to see where this is in the video so you can refer back to it if you need to later on. Now, this is where I need to make an executive decision. The first Dáil was filled with Sinn Féin members. However, a lot of this didn't have to do with the political party itself and was mostly about governing. This channel is about election-related things like the party itself and not about governance. Therefore, I'm not going to get into the Dáil and the decisions made there. This also means that we aren't going to go too deep into the Irish War of Independence, which continued until July 11th of 1921. Suffice to say that once the state of war was declared by the Dáil, there were a number of skirmishes that led to 491 IRA and other pro-Dáil members being killed, 936 members of the British Army, and 900 civilians were also killed in the fighting. I say skirmishes because there weren't any real grand battles like we saw in World War I. Most of the fighting were tit-for-tat killings that happened on a smaller scale. Toward the end of the war, the IRA was seriously low on both weapons and ammunition, using extremely outdated weapons that didn't cause any real damage. However, the British didn't know this and assumed that the IRA was still strong and could not be defeated. However, a few months prior to the cessation of fighting in Ireland, the British government passed the Government of Ireland Act 1920, or the Fourth Home Rule Bill. Now, at this time, most of the people in Ireland weren't interested in a Home Rule Bill that would keep the British Crown as the sovereign They wanted an independent Irish Republic. The bill proposed that there were to be two devolved governments in the north and south of Ireland. The jurisdictions of these two devolved governments created the partition of Ireland that we currently know today. The law received royal assent on December 23, 1920, and was in effect on May 3, 1921. Elections were to be held in both of these legislative bodies. In the north, James Craig's Ulster Unionist Party, a party that still exists today, won 40 of the 52 seats in the House of Commons in Northern Ireland in Belfast, with Sinn Féin winning 4 seats and, of course, abstaining. In the south, Sinn Féin won 124 of the 128 seats in the House of Commons of Southern Ireland. Those who were members of the first Dáil approved that these election results were to be the composition of the second Dáil, with 130 Sinn Féin members, 40 Ulster Unionists, 6 Nationalists, and 4 Independent Unionists who had been elected in the south. The elected Sinn Féin members were the only members who took their seats in the second Dáil, a body that only met twice. The first time was in 1921, and the second time was to approve a treaty in 1922. To end the fighting in Ireland, the British government approached the leaders of the Dáil to work out a peace deal and a plan for Ireland. Essentially, the British government said that it would end the hostilities against the Irish Republican Army, as well as work with establishing an Irish Free State, which would still be part of the British Dominion, much like Canada. The British approached Eamon de Valera to move forward with the negotiations, and de Valera created a negotiating committee to represent the second Dáil. Those representing the Irish delegation were Arthur Griffith, Michael Collins, Robert Barton, Eamon Dugan, and George Gavin Duffy. According to the instructions that these men were given, they were to keep in constant regular contact with the Dáil cabinet in Dublin, and that Dublin would be informed of any decisions that were to be made. Now, this is where a lot of people speculate about the role of de Valera and what his true intentions were. While the committee mentioned previously did receive instructions on how to proceed in the negotiations, the instructions were very vague, which led to more confusion. But why wasn't de Valera part of this group? As historian Tim Pat Coogan states, quote, "But what is surprising for a biographer, even after the lapse in years, even though one is perfectly aware of the fact that he did not go to London, is just how little of substance de Valera contributed to these crucially important set of Anglo-Irish discussions. This is particularly interesting considering that de Valera needed to be involved with everything, according to future Taoiseach Jack Lynch saying that de Valera was a stickler for detail." End of quote. For someone who was so invested in Ireland as well as detail-oriented, why was he suspiciously removed from the negotiating process? I will defer yet again to Tim Pat Coogan, the foremost authority on Eamon de Valera. Quote, "With the weight of evidence point inexorably toward the verdict that, during his July conversations with Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, he had seen the future and decided that it would not work for him. His formula with dealing with this unpalatable reality was, we must have scapegoats." End of quote. As the negotiations went on, Griffith and Collins became the main negotiators with the British, purposely keeping the other 3 men out of the loop for various reasons. But another problem persisted, which was that de Valera wanted a fully independent, non-partition Irish state, while the British were not willing to go that far. This would have kept the negotiations in a continual stalemate. However, Michael Collins' stepping stone approach, which Griffith supported, would be the best way forward in these negotiations. The stepping stone approach was to achieve Irish independence through small steps instead of asking for everything at once. Even though de Valera was warned by other members of the committee that concessions were being made by Collins and Griffith, de Valera stated that any treaty needed to be submitted to Dublin first before any action could be taken. However, the British government threatening the negotiations with continued war, the treaty was signed which would create the partitioned Irish Free State, pledging an oath of allegiance to the Irish Free State and to be faithful to King George V and successor monarchs. Of course, De Valera and his supporters were totally opposed to the treaty since he had taken a hardline stance on a non-partition independent Irish Republic, which was never going to happen. Now, this is where things get a little confusing. Many people assumed that once the treaty was signed by the negotiating committee, it was ratified, but that wasn't the case. The treaty was signed on December 6, 1921 in London by the negotiators. But a cabinet meeting was called by De Valera on December 8th in Dublin and voted 4-3 to move the treaty to the full Dáil for a vote on December 14th. Yes, the delegation in London might not have directly consulted Dublin on the final treaty itself, which it should have. However, the power given to them was that they could essentially act unilaterally as a group, which they did. The debate was extremely contentious, but on January 7th, the Dáil voted 64-57 in favor of the treaty. De Valera resigned as president with his contingency walking out of the Dáil with him. 2 days later, Arthur Griffith was elected president of the Dáil. Because of the passing of the treaty, new elections were to be held for what would be known as the Third Dáil. Even though Sinn Féin was split, both Eamon de Valera and Michael Collins agreed at the 1922 Ardèche, which was held in February, that the party should run as one party. The reason for this is that the Labour Party and the New Farmers Party had considerable support. Had Sinn Féin split into two parties, it's possible that the other parties could capitalize on the divisions. However, it was abundantly clear that there would be a split in the party nonetheless, with most of the Irish Republican Army siding with De Valera. In May, a majority of the IRA rejected the Dáil as the Irish authority and resumed conflict against the forces of the Irish Free State, who received help from the British. So, as I mentioned previously, this is a video about Sinn Féin as a political party and not about military conflicts themselves. Therefore, I won't be talking about the actual Civil War. The Great War channel has a good video about the Irish Civil War, and I recommend checking out what they have already done. Also, regarding the 1922 elections, there really isn't much written about them, and that's probably because many knew that it was just some sort of formality before the Civil War started. Essentially, both sides knew when the conflict would start, though it had, in fact, started a few weeks earlier. As for our discussion about Sinn Féin, the most important and very big factor is that both Michael Collins and Arthur Griffith died in August of 1922. Collins was killed in an ambush and Griffith died of natural causes. This led to W.T. Cosgrave becoming both the president of the Dáil and the chairman of the Provisional government. Still, this is where things get a little tricky. Those who were pro-treaty were running the government and were less interested in party politics and labels, or even in establishing a political party or anything to do with party business. Those who were anti-treaty basically had nothing to come back to politically except Sinn Féin, and the IRA was still strongly anti-treaty as well as involved with Sinn Féin. For W.T. Cosgrave, he didn't see the need to form a political party now that the country was just coming out of a civil war and elections weren't the highest of priority. Even with this being the case, those who were in the pro-treaty camp knew that the day to fight an election battle was going to come and they had to prepare for it. A preliminary conference took place with 58 deputies on December 7th, 1922, in which the group decided to revive the name Cumann na nGaedheal, the name of the organization that was involved with the original Sinn Féin merger in 1907. The party was officially established on April 27, 1923, at Mansion House in a meeting attended by 150 delegates. It was hard for the party to actually come together, but it was hard for the party to get together. James Dolan, brother of Charles Dolan, was the secretary of the Standing Committee and required government ministers to attend the meetings, but they reluctantly did so. I mean, it makes sense, since the anti-treaty members were going to abstain from holding office anyway, and the legitimacy of the Irish Free State still came from the British. Cosgrave and his party didn't really need to put together a political party. Therefore, according to future Taoiseach Garrett Fitzgerald, whose father was involved in the early days of Cumann na nGaedheal, the party didn't have any grassroots organization and failed to raise funds. Fast forward to 1933 and the party would change its name to Fine Gael, which is one of the main political parties in Ireland today. But since this video is about Sinn Féin and not about Cumann or Fine Gael, we're going to leave this branching off and focus back on Sinn Féin. In 1923, a new election was to be held. Because this was a newly established government, the composition of the Dáil was to change. Not only did the number of seats change in the Dáil from 128 to 153, but the franchise was expanded to allow men and women over the age of 21 to vote. With that, an election was called to populate the newly expanded Dáil on August 27, 1923. During this election, Sinn Féin labeled themselves as Republican, since they claimed to be the only political party that identified with the Republican values of the 1916 Rising. Honestly, the campaign wasn't really eventful. Cumann really didn't campaign, but Sinn Féin did. In the end, the Republicans won 44 seats and 27.4% of the vote. While this did make them the second largest party in Ireland, Cumann received 39%. Since the Labour Party and Farmers Party were also non-abstentionist parties, this meant that 21.8% of the seats in the Dáil abstained from their seats. This essentially made abstentionism useless. Even if Sinn Féin had won a majority of the seats in the Dáil, their abstentionism meant that they couldn't even ask for a quorum during any sitting of the Dáil because, well, they were abstaining from participation. Unlike in 1918, when Sinn Féin won a majority of the seats in Ireland and set up the first Dáil, which had legitimacy nationwide, that wasn't the case after the 1923 election. Essentially, Sinn Féin could be nothing more than a protest vote. In 1925, Sinn Féin conducted an internal audit of their party to understand why their party was in decline. While they did find that their party was in financial debt, usually because party funds were basically funding weapons, ammunition, and personnel within the IRA, they also determined that the party suffered from their abstentionist position as well as a lack of any political focus on socio-economic problems in Ireland. Therefore, a serious debate of idealism versus pragmatism took place, with the pragmatists advocating for building an independent Irish Republic within the framework of the Irish Free State. These pragmatists also supported abstentionism in Northern Ireland, since any win there wouldn't have any impact on the policy in either Northern Ireland or the United Kingdom. But in the Republic, they basically stood hopelessly watching other parties make policy and had zero impact on defeating any policy they disagreed with. In May of 1925, the party standing committee discussed the abstentionist issue. De Valera stated that the party could be more effective in pushing Republican ideas, like removing the oath of allegiance, if they were able to sit in the Dáil and participate in the democratic process. However, the Irish Republican Army was also discussing their relationship with Sinn Féin, seeing it as a purely political discussion group and nothing more. This essentially led to a split between the two organizations. Still, with this being the case, there were overlaps where people would be members of both. During the 1925 Ardèche, there was a proposal by the County Kerry branch of Sinn Féin, the only constituency where Sinn Féin won a majority of the members of the Dáil, or TDs, which asked the party to commit to supporting abstentionism until there was an all-Irish republic. Now, of course, this wasn't revolutionary since that's what they had always supported, but De Valera opposed this approach. De Valera, out of all the members of the party, knew that abstentionism equated to political isolation. Now, was he driven by ambition? Since De Valera was a politician, he knew that his own political isolation would also make him less significant in shaping Ireland's history. Obviously, he wanted to be part of that history. For De Valera, it was time for Sinn Féin to take a new approach. In Sinn Féin's first meeting in 1926, held on January 6, De Valera stated that he would take his seat in the Dáil if the oath of allegiance was not required. At the Ardèche in March of 1926, De Valera moved to change the rules of Sinn Féin to allow members of Sinn Féin to take their seats in the Dáil if the Irish Free State removed the oath. However, for the hardliners, this was too much. It was either a 32-county Irish Republic or absolute abstentionism. There was no gray area. One of those who was staunchly opposed to this was Father Michael O'Flanagan, who was considered the most radical Irish Republican priest in all of Ireland and a member of Sinn Féin. It is said that O'Flanagan was asked by De Valera, who remember was the president of Sinn Féin, to chair the subcommittee that oversaw the proposal introduced by De Valera. This made O'Flanagan a strong as well as main opponent to De Valera. De Valera's proposal was brought up to the 500-member meeting, but was defeated 223 to 218. The next morning, De Valera gave his last speech as president. In April, De Valera and many of his supporters, as well as 21 Republican TDs that had been elected in the 1923 election, left Sinn Féin and would create their own political party called Fianna Fáil, which is Ireland's most successful party to date. When De Valera and his fellow TDs approached the government with the willingness to take their seats if they removed the oath of allegiance, Cosgrave's government turned Fianna Fáil down, and the members didn't take their seats. On July 20th, 1927, the Dáil introduced a bill saying that all candidates running for office were required to take the oath of allegiance. This put De Valera into a corner of either accepting the oath or being out of politics forever. De Valera took the oath on August 12, 1927, and Fianna Fáil took their seats. And with that, we've come to the end of this chapter. Over the course of 3 years, Sinn Féin went through two major splits that nearly wiped out the party. This left Sinn Féin being a shell of its former self. And with that, we move on to the next chapter. Even though W.T. Cosgrave and Eamon de Valera had taken large chunks of Sinn Féin into their respective camps, Sinn Féin still existed. While abstaining from the Dáil that currently exists in the Irish Free State because they deemed it illegal, Sinn Féin members now sat in what they called the Second Dáil, which they claim was the last legitimate government of Ireland. However, the party had lost popularity, with Sean Buckley, a former member of Sinn Féin and now a member of Fianna Fáil, saying in 1927, quote, "The Sinn Féin organization had lost the confidence of the great mass of the Irish people. Sinn Féin is out. It has nothing new to offer. It has no growth." End of quote. The party was in sharp decline. John J. O'Kelly, who was a member of Sinn Féin since its founding in 1905, took over as president of Sinn Féin on October 31st, 1926. Now, not much is really written about O'Kelly, but he seemed to be more into protecting the Irish language and heritage than he was about fighting any political battles. In Tim Pat Coogan's book about Eamon de Valera, O'Kelly's name only appears once. He, alongside with Count Plunkett, who was still a member of Sinn Féin, also founded the Academy of Christian Arts in the 1930s. But during his tenure as party leader, which lasted until April 30th, 1931, the party virtually collapsed. During the June 1927 Irish election, the party only received 3.6% of the vote, a 23.8% drop from what de Valera brought the last election. In fact, two other parties, the Farmers' Party and the National League, which was just basically the remnants of the Irish Parliamentary Party, finished ahead of Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin would only win 5 seats in this election. But come to the next election, which was just a few months later in September of 1927, Sinn Féin fielded no candidates, thus receiving no votes. O'Kelly was eventually replaced by Brian O'Higgins, who continued in that position until 1933. He was a diehard Republican and veteran of the 1916 Easter Rising, being one of the founding members of the Irish Volunteers. During O'Higgins' tenure, the Irish Republican Army, itself a dying organization, started to infiltrate Sinn Féin. In the 1931 Ardèche, the party passed a number of resolutions that were supported by the IRA. Father O'Flanagan went as far as saying that he would support setting up an army dictatorship. However, there was a split that developed between O'Higgins and O'Flanagan. Father O'Flanagan, a Catholic priest, said that the Pope was an enemy of Irish republicanism, while O'Higgins disagreed. Yes, you heard that right, a priest saying that the Pope was an enemy. Small squabbles and infighting would happen within Sinn Féin, and with the party saying it would take no part in the upcoming Irish elections to be held on January 24th, 1933. O'Higgins later resigned from the party after the election, and Father Michael O'Flanagan was its new leader. Now, Father O'Flanagan was quite active in Republican politics prior to taking over as president of Sinn Féin, but by this time the organization was basically a shell of what it had been, even in the early days. Not only was the party not really active, it almost seemed as if those who were keeping the party afloat did so for some sort of sentimental or nostalgic reason. On October 24, 1934, Sinn Féin's Ardèche only had 70 delegates and excluded the media from the event. A year later, at the Ardèche on December 2, 1935, Cahill O'Murchada was elected president of Sinn Féin. O'Murchada had also been involved with Sinn Féin in its Easter Rising days, being the manager of Arthur Griffith's newspaper Nationality. He was also an Irish volunteer, making him one of the few Sinn Féin members that were actually involved with the Easter Rising. Under O'Murchada, the party continued to basically do nothing. However, both O'Murchada and Brian O'Higgins, the former Sinn Féin president, had been negotiating with the Irish Republican Army to completely turn over the second Dáil to the IRA. But while these negotiations were going on, the party changed leaders, with Margaret Buckley, who also joined the party in 1905, being elected president on December 6, 1937. A few weeks after Buckley became president, the Irish people went to the polls to vote on a new constitution. The constitution, which would establish the Republic of Ireland, which of course was partitioned and only included the 26 lower counties, was passed with 56.5% of the vote. Sinn Féin protested the vote since it considered the second Dáil to be the last legitimate government and hung black flags from their headquarters at 9 Parnell Street in Dublin. Still, Buckley was both an organizer and a staunch Republican, having spent time in the Irish Republican Women's Prison and being an organizer for both Sinn Féin and the Irish Women Workers' Union, which led to the unions having a stronger voice in Sinn Féin. But still, even if she came across as someone who was more focused on raising funds for veterans of the Easter Rising, she was involved in repairing and strengthening ties with the Irish Republican Army. On December 8, 1938, a few weeks after Buckley was re-elected as president at Sinn Féin's Ardèche, which only had 60 candidates, the second Dáil met at the house of Mary McSweeney in Glanmire. During this meeting, the second Dáil officially handed itself over to the Irish Republican Army. This officially meant that Sinn Féin Republicans now saw the IRA and the Army Council of the IRA as the legitimate heirs of the Irish Republic. This wasn't necessarily a handover of the second Dáil as much as it was the IRA taking it. Sinn Féin had become so weak and insignificant, they weren't even informed ahead of time of what was to take place. With this transfer, Sinn Féin was no longer the standard bearer of the second Dáil. They were essentially a Republican organization with absolutely no political influence at all. But it was still considered a political party and technically separate from the IRA. That's important to know in a few moments from now. If the 1930s weren't bad enough, the 1940s were worse. The number of members that Sinn Féin had throughout the 1940s hovered around 100. One Republican newspaper said, quote, "For years Sinn Féin had been content to pursue its way quietly and unobtrusively, relying on a small band of loyal stalwarts who had kept the organization going in good times and bad." End of quote. With the end of World War II, Sinn Féin wanted to reconnect with the IRA. The party, which was in a weaker position than it had been in the early 1940s, was essentially there for the taking. With that, at the 1950 Ardèche, the IRA took over Sinn Féin. Now, this is different than the meeting at Mary McSweeney's house. There, the second Dáil was taken by the IRA. Now, the political party itself was taken over. The new president of Sinn Féin, Paddy McLogan, chaired the first IRA Army Convention after the war. The current IRA Chief of Staff, Tony Megan, was elected Honorary Joint Secretary of the party. The party's new Secretary General, Charles Murphy, was the IRA's Adjunct General. But at the same time the IRA was taking over Sinn Féin, it was also making changes to its policy. The IRA's Army Council had announced an end to military action against the Republic of Ireland. They stated that while they might not have supported the government in Dublin, the Irish were not their enemy, but the English were. Therefore, IRA tactics would be focused in British-controlled Northern Ireland instead. Also, Sinn Féin's new president, Paddy McLogan, was also from Northern Ireland. There were a few other changes to Sinn Féin as well. The party was significantly more focused on receiving the support of the Catholic Church. This was a departure from the far-left trade unionist policies that Buckley supported, or pure republicanism supported by many of those who made up the Second Dáil. This essentially moved Sinn Féin from being on the center-left to left of the political spectrum to being on the right, as they didn't oppose the idea of a Catholic theocracy. The first non-local election that Sinn Féin was to contest showed that the IRA had fully taken over the party. In the 1950 UK general election, Sinn Féin ran Jimmy Steele as their only candidate in Belfast West. Steele, who had no political experience, was a prominent member of the IRA, whose IRA activities stretched back to the 1920s. At the time of the election, he was actually serving time in prison. He didn't perform well and only received 2.2% of the vote. But in the 1955 UK general election, Sinn Féin fielded candidates in all 12 of the constituencies with some sort of ties to the IRA, with many of them in prison at the time. The Nationalist Party decided not to contest the election, with Labour only fielding 4 candidates. Sinn Féin went on to win 2 of those seats, in Fermanagh and South Tyrone, and in Mid-Ulster. The Mid-Ulster candidate, Tom Mitchell, won by a very slight 260-vote margin. However, because he was a convicted felon connected to an IRA raid on an army barracks in Omagh, the House of Commons said that he was ineligible to take his seat, though he wouldn't have done so anyways because of Sinn Féin's abstentionist policies. A by-election was held in which Mitchell ran again and won, this time by 806 votes. The House of Commons eventually awarded the seat to Charles Beatty, who was Mitchell's opponent. However, he had to resign because he had been holding an office in which he profited from the government, and thus another by-election was held. Mitchell ran again but lost by 4,481 votes. The main reason for the loss was that the Nationalist Anti-Partition Party won 10.9% of the vote. If the Nationalists hadn't split the vote, then it is possible and probably likely that Mitchell would have won for a third time. Philip Clark in Fermanagh and South Tyrone was also in prison for the same Omagh Army Barracks raid, but the House of Commons didn't have a by-election and just removed him since he was a political prisoner. But still, Sinn Féin showed that even being in the political wilderness, they had some political power. In 1958, elections for the Northern Irish government were held, but Sinn Féin decided not to contest those elections. The Unionist government, which controlled the Northern Irish government, passed legislation making it less likely for Republican candidates to want to run in Stormont. In the 1920s, a law was passed that required candidates to take an oath for swearing organizations that were outlawed in Northern Ireland. This, of course, included the IRA, in which many of the potential candidates would not have only supported, but would be active members of themselves. But why was Sinn Féin performing well all of a sudden? Obviously, the voters who voted for Sinn Féin knew they were voting for members of the IRA or political prisoners. But this was mostly due to Sinn Féin being seen as a protest vote against Catholic discrimination than anything else. As Professor Kevin Rafter states, quote, "Republicans took a very restricted message from their electoral performance at the Westminster contest in 1955. Rather than viewing it as a manifestation of broad Catholic unhappiness in Northern Ireland and a popular base to be tapped towards achieving specific Republican objectives, they saw the result instead as an endorsement of military action." End of quote. This seems to show that because Sinn Féin had simply become the political arm of the IRA, there was a lack of political acumen within the party. It was at this time that the IRA started Operation Harvest, which is commonly known as the Border Campaign. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, this is a video about the political party Sinn Féin and not about paramilitary activities. But in short, the Border Campaign was a number of incursions into Northern Ireland that attacked road, rail, telephone, and communication structures. From a military perspective, it really was a failure because it didn't have any impact on the British Army or the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the police force in Northern Ireland. During the Border Campaign, Sinn Féin was basically the propaganda arm of the IRA. The electoral success of the campaign seems to be mixed. In the 1957 Irish election, Sinn Féin won 5.3% of first preference votes, and 4 members were elected who abstained from sitting in the Dáil. While some might say that this is proof of the electoral success of the border campaign in its early days, it's more likely that Sinn Féin performed better because they had more candidates than in the previous election. One of those who won was Rory O'Brady, a 25-year-old school teacher who had been a Republican activist as well as involved with the border campaign. Because of this activity, he was soon interned after his electoral win as the newly elected government of Eamon de Valera introduced internment without trial in July of 1957, a far cry from de Valera's policies during his anti-treaty days. What was important about this policy, which existed in the North as well, was that it would strip Sinn Féin of its leadership being able to campaign publicly. Still, in 1959, many nationalists were tired of the IRA border campaign. This was reflected in the 1959 Westminster election results, where Sinn Féin dropped to 11%, losing 12.6% from their previous election. In Fermanagh and South Tyrone, where Philip Clark won 50.2% of the vote 4 years earlier, Sinn Féin candidate James Martin won only 18.6% of the vote. Tom Mitchell ran again in Mid-Ulster, but only won 30% of the vote, losing by 18,923 votes, and this time there was no national split like there had been in the Mid-Ulster by-election previously. Further electoral decline would happen in the Irish general election of 1961. Sinn Féin dropped to 3.1% of first preference votes and lost all 4 of the seats that they had previously held. Simply put, the border campaign didn't have the support that it had in the early days. With the border campaign now in its 6th year, Sinn Féin was really seen as a political party that solely focused on agitating the British and pushing propaganda for the border campaign. It was being taken less and less seriously as a political party, with only diehard Republicans now supporting the party in the North and the Irish Republic. As Kevin Rafter would say, quote, "Many people who were sympathetic to the Republican cause were less receptive to the violence associated with the IRA, which in turn tended to reduce their willingness to back Sinn Féin candidates." End of quote. Essentially, the elections were more like a referendum measuring the support for the IRA's activities. During the border campaign, Sinn Féin wasn't a serious political party. As Sean McStephan, who would later become the chief of staff of the IRA, said about politics, quote, "The best strategy is to go all out in local elections, build up from that base, and then wait until you can put enough candidates in a general election to give the people a clear choice between straight Republican and free state policies." End of quote. But the fact is that Sinn Féin didn't have any policies. All of the propaganda was focused on defeating the British and nothing more. Once the IRA announced that the border campaign had officially ended, many thought that it would be the end of both the IRA and Sinn Féin, with the New York Times stating, quote, "The IRA belongs to history, and it belongs to better men in better times that are gone. So does Sinn Féin. Let's put a wreath of red roses on their grave and move on." End of quote. After the border campaign in 1962, both the IRA and Sinn Féin made leadership changes that would drastically change the party's direction. For the IRA, it was Cathal Goulding. For Sinn Féin, the president was Thomas Macchiola. Macchiola had been interned during World War II and was also in the cross-border arms raids that I mentioned earlier in 1953. Even though both men were involved with IRA activities, these two also marked a massive change in focus. Both men wanted to move both organizations away from the violence and focus on issue advocacy. At the 1964 Ardèche, Sinn Féin supported leftist ideas that would make it the furthest left party in either part of Ireland at the time. They were also among the first Eurosceptics questioning Ireland seeking admission into the European Economic Community. Because they had shifted from being more political, they had organized more protests against what they considered the establishment, whether privately or publicly owned. Though Goulding and Macchiola wanted to build a political organization, they didn't want to jump right back into politics immediately. After seeing the disaster of Sinn Féin over the last decade, they wanted to make sure that they had a politically ready and savvy organization that could actually formulate policy and be real contenders. The 1954 election showed them that it could be done, and if Sinn Féin had continued to take a serious political track, they might have been able to build on that success. Still, Sinn Féin itself wasn't strong, and neither was the IRA. As Goulding would say, quote, "By 1967, the movement had become dormant. It wasn't even active in any political sense or in any revolutionary sense. Membership was falling off, people had gone away, units of the IRA and the associations of Sinn Féin had become almost non-existent." End of quote. Maggiola argued that if Sinn Féin were to become more politically relevant again, they needed to consider removing abstentionism from the Dáil as one of their official positions. He loftily claimed at the 1966 Ardèche that Sinn Féin would win a majority in the Dáil within a decade, but it has become apparent that Sinn Féin was becoming more of a discussion group instead of an organization that sought change. But there was another issue as well. Once Goulding and Maggiola took over, the leadership of both the IRA and Sinn Féin were again based in Dublin, with less focus on Northern Ireland compared to the years of Paddy McLogan. Those living and involved in politics in the Republic of Ireland had different issues. Issues in the Republic focused more on bread and butter issues, while wider sectarian divisions continued to plague almost all Northern Catholics. Sinn Féin continued to focus on making the party a far-left organization, as well as working with other far-left organizations to create a national liberation front. They also continued to discuss whether the party should abstain from the Dáil elections in the Republic. The 1968 Ardèche put together a party commission to explore these options. At the Army Convention of the IRA in December of 1969, most of those participating supported this shift in strategy. However, at the Sinn Féin Ardèche on January 11, 1970, in order to implement these changes to Sinn Féin's constitution, the motion had to win by a vote of 2/3. And while a majority supported dropping abstentionism, 153 members, it wasn't enough to pass, as 104 members voted against it. Sean McStephen and his supporters, who voted against the motion, left the Ardèche to form their own movement. This new organization called the First Dáil the legitimate government of the Irish Republic, thus opposing the partition of Ireland, and supported abstentionism. This new leadership also focused on a return to a military campaign against the British government, as McStephen called Sinn Féin meetings, quote, "boring and a total waste of time," end of quote. This new group was called the Provisional IRA, with the political arm being the Provisional Sinn Féin, which leads us to our next chapter. "1970 was a year that would have a lasting impact even to this day. It was in that year, on January 11th, 1970, that the Provisional Irish Republican Army was born. The Provos, as it was known, would be responsible for many of the deaths both in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. According to the Conflict and Politics in Northern Ireland website, or CAIN, the most comprehensive website on the period known as the Troubles in Northern Ireland, the Provos were linked to the deaths of 1,705 people, most of any group throughout the Troubles. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I'm going to try to separate the IRA activities from the Sinn Féin activities as much as possible. However, this might be a little bit hard from this point on, or at least until the 1990s. Because of this, I'm not going to be focusing on certain events unless they had a political impact on Sinn Féin itself. This is the main reason I didn't mention the Battle of the Bogside, an extremely important event which is considered the starting point of the Troubles. And while it was important, it didn't have any impact on Sinn Féin, and the Irish Republican Army wasn't really involved with it. So for those of you who know a lot about the Troubles, this is why some major events might be omitted, because this, after all, is a video about Sinn Féin as a political entity and not necessarily the Troubles themselves. So, as I mentioned in the previous chapter, there was a split in Sinn Féin. From this point forward, our focus will be on the Provisional Sinn Féin, the group led by Sean McStephen, Rory O'Brady, Daithí O'Connell, as well as a young Martin McGuinness and Jerry Adams. But what happened to the other group, the 154 delegates that sided with Cathal Goulding and Thomas Mackiola? Well, they formed their own political party in the Republic of Ireland called the official Sinn Féin, which stuck to its far-left Marxist-Leninist political theory. The party first contested the 1973 Irish general election, where it received 1.1% of the vote but no seats. In the Irish local elections a year later, the party would win 1.3% of the vote and pick up 3 seats. The official Sinn Féin would then change its name to Sinn Féin, the Workers' Party. It was in the 1980s when Thomas Maggiola's party, now just called the Workers' Party, saw their heyday. During the 1981 Irish general election, Joe Sherlock would win the Workers' Party's first seat in the Dáil. The February 1982 election saw the party gain 2 more seats in the Dáil, but lose those seats in November of 1982. In the 1987 Irish election, the party gained 2 more seats, totaling 4 seats. But in the 1989 election, the leadership being passed to Prántas de Rosa, the party jumped to 7 seats in the Dáil. At the time of the 1989 election, the Workers' Party could be deemed a communist party, advocating for stronger ties with the Soviet Union. However, once the Soviet Union collapsed, many within the Workers' Party shifted toward a leftist view of a free market economy, not a centralized one. As a result, de Rosa started his own party called the Democratic Left, which outperformed the Workers' Party and Sinn Féin combined in 1992, winning 4 seats in the Dáil. It's at this point where the Workers' Party collapsed. From 1997 to 2020, the party wouldn't eclipse 0.4% of the vote, and in 2024 didn't even contest the election. The same collapse happened at the local level. In 1991, the Workers' Party won 24 seats, but that would drop to only 3 seats by 1999. They continued to win at least 1 seat until 2024, when they lost their last seat. While the party's main focus was in the Irish Republic, they did contest elections in Northern Ireland. They never really appeared on the radar in the Westminster elections, but did win 8 seats in the 1973 local elections. But with each passing year, the numbers of seats declined until they were shut out in 1997. The organization also had a paramilitary wing called the Official IRA, which was responsible for 53 deaths according to Kane. However, they weren't nearly as active as the Provisional IRA. And that's basically a short history of the Official IRA and the Workers' Party in Ireland. But now our focus shifts over to the Provisional Sinn Féin and the Provisional Irish Republican Army, which we will just now refer to as Sinn Féin or the IRA or the Irish Republican Army. As was mentioned previously, the main area of contention when the organization split was that the Provos wanted return to the military campaign. Therefore, there isn't much to talk about as far as the political activity in Sinn Féin itself in the early 1970s. In fact, it would be hard to call Sinn Féin the propaganda wing of the Provisional IRA, as the Provos usually sent out their own communiques through the IRA itself and not through Sinn Féin. But even though the party itself might have been quiet, there were a few important things to know about the early 1970s that impacted the future of Sinn Féin. What is important to know about the Provisional IRA is that almost all of their focus was on removing the British from Ireland. Therefore, an overwhelming focus was put on Northern Ireland instead of the Republic of Ireland, whereas the official IRA primarily focused on electoral politics in the Republic. This means that the IRA, for most people in Northern Ireland, was the Provisional IRA, as the official IRA was basically non-existent in the North. The Provisional IRA spent 1970 and 1971 focusing on attacks on occupying British forces in Northern Ireland. In 1970, 11 deaths were attributed to the Provos, with that number rising to 84 deaths in 1971. However, 57 deaths were attributed to the British Army at that time as well. But before we get into one of the most significant years in modern Irish history, it's important to understand the climate in Northern Ireland between 1969 and 1971. The main issue in Northern Ireland for Republicans was the treatment of those who were Catholic. Not only were Catholics harassed by Protestants, such as having large pro-Protestant victory parades marching through Catholic neighborhoods, like the Apprentice Boys, but they were also discriminated at the workplace as most businesses would only hire Protestants. Queen's University Belfast determined that the Catholic unemployment rate in the early 1970s was 17.3%, at the same time that the Protestant unemployment rate was at 6.6%. With the struggle happening, there were questions as to what the goals were and how to go about attaining those goals. Almost all of the organizations that sought to support Catholics were Irish nationalists, as they thought that a united Ireland would lead to less discrimination against Catholics. Still, the means to achieve those ends were quite different, so let's go through those now. First, you have the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, modeled after the nonviolent movement of the Civil Rights Movement in the United States. I'm not going to get into the internal politics and events of the Civil Rights Movement, but their main objective was to end discrimination against Catholics through marches and protests throughout Northern Ireland. Yes, there were members of the official Sinn Féin involved with this movement, but this had more to do with ideological similarities and not about moving NICRA into an armed conflict. Still, the civil rights marches, deemed illegal by the British government, were met with violence by both pro-unionist civilians as well as the Royal Ulster Constabulary, also known as the RUC. Members would be beaten and jailed for their involvement in these non-violent, non-compliant protests. The organization itself didn't get into electoral politics, but elected politicians were involved with the movement. The second means to improve the living condition of Catholics was through the politicians themselves. These politicians, as well as their political parties, could run the gambit of the Irish political spectrum. One of the parties that emerged at the time was the Social Democratic and Labour Party, or the SDLP. The SDLP supported Irish unity and a social democratic approach to governing, but also took their seats in Westminster, not being an abstentionist party. Others, such as Bernadette Devlin, a 21-year-old student who was elected to Parliament in 1970, were more staunchly socialist and favored Republican causes. But they too took their seats in Westminster, abandoning abstentionism. The main difference between the SDLP and other, more staunchly Republican elected officials was that the SDLP would strongly condemn violence, while others simply turned a blind eye to violence, sometimes justifying provisional IRA attacks against the British Army. And that brings us to our final group, which was the paramilitary organizations. The most prominent paramilitary organization in Northern Ireland was the Provisional IRA. But in 1971, their tactics were considered to be on the fringes. However, the Provo started to gain traction as some Catholics saw the armed struggle to be the only way to protect themselves, as they saw the civil rights and political options as being futile. Now, it's important to know that we really haven't talked about the struggle between Catholics and Protestants until now, because that's a mischaracterization of the situation. To me, many in the United States want to conflate the IRA with Catholicism, but that also fails to realize the connections between Protestants and Loyalist paramilitary organizations. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, Republicans, which is what the IRA was, were those who supported the 1916 proclamation of the Irish Republic, which united all 32 counties. The only time prior to this when we saw a strong connection between the IRA and Catholicism was in the 1950s under the leadership of Paddy McLogan, but that was basically it. But even in the 1970s, as well as subsequent years, the IRA was not a Catholic organization. It was just, for the lack of a better definition, a marriage of convenience that the IRA found themselves as the defenders of those who were Catholic. As a matter of fact, the Provisional Sinn Féin and IRA were strongly secular. Now, I tried to stay non-political in this video, but I think this point needs to be made, which is that most Loyalist paramilitary organizations were strongly connected to Protestantism. Yes, there were true unionist organizations like the Ulster Unionist Party, which looked at unionism through a political lens instead of religious divisions. But the paramilitary organizations themselves were more engaged in tit-for-tat killings by those who they deemed as Catholics, not Republicans. In fact, in their declaration of war against the Irish Republican Army, the Ulster Volunteer Force said, quote, "We are heavily armed Protestants dedicated to the cause," end of quote. In fact, the cover name of the UVF used was the Protestant Action Force. So yes, loyalists were way more connected to Protestantism than the IRA was connected to Catholicism. Now, I'm not making this distinction to say that one side is better than the other. I'm making this distinction because many, particularly in the United States, exclusively call the Troubles a sectarian conflict, Protestants versus Catholic, especially when labeling the IRA as the Catholics. The situation is way more nuanced than that, so I wanted to make this point because I thought that it had to be made. Now, back to January of 1972. On January 30th of that year, the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association organized a march through the middle of Derry to protest internment without trial. Again, the British deemed this march to be illegal. However, amongst the marchers were Bernadette Devlin and Ivan Cooper, both members of the British Parliament. This march was to take place in a hotbed of conflict between the local Catholic population and the British Army, known as the Bogside, which is where the modern Northern Irish conflict, known as the Troubles, officially started in August of 1969 in the Battle of the Bogside. As marchers made their way through the town, some of them started antagonizing the British Army and the RUC who was watching the procession. However, the action taken by those antagonizing the army wasn't any different than previous encounters, and in fact was extremely tame compared to what happened in the Battle of the Bogside. Now, I'm not going to get into Bloody Sunday a great deal, but suffice to say that the British Army opened fire on the crowd, killing 14 innocent people. As a result, the Provisional IRA would become the benefactor of the actions in Derry that evening, as young men would join the IRA to seek revenge on the British. With this being the case, 1972 was the bloodiest year of the Troubles, with 480 deaths occurring. The Provisional IRA was said to have been responsible for 216 deaths, with the British Army said to have killed 78 people, and unorganized loyalist organizations responsible for 63 deaths. However, even though the number of IRA soldiers had increased, so had the number of those who had talents outside of the armed conflict. At this time, Sinn Féin was deemed an illegal organization by the British government. In 1972, the president of Sinn Féin was Rory O'Brady. O'Brady's tenure didn't really create any policy, but instead reiterated IRA talking points as he was a strong advocate to continue the armed struggle. However, with a large boost in IRA membership coming from the north after Bloody Sunday, Sinn Féin's rhetoric shifted toward opposing the British Army. In 1975, the Provisional IRA agreed to a ceasefire with the British government and the Northern Ireland office. During the ceasefire, O'Brady stated that a 12-point plan had been agreed upon between Sinn Féin and the British, in which the British would leave Northern Ireland. However, the British said that they never agreed to this and rejected what O'Brady had stated. As a result, the ceasefire would end in 1976. That same year, Gerry Adams would begin writing in the Republican News under the byline Brownie, in which he advocated for Sinn Féin to be a more political force, both in the North and South. And during the late 1970s, Adams and his supporters started laying the groundwork for a takeover of Sinn Féin. There were a few reasons why Adams was interested in changing directions. First had to do with the actions of the IRA in Belfast. Belfast IRA leader Billy McKee targeted both Protestants and members of the official IRA, which was heavily criticized by Adams as it was not in line with what the Republican cause was all about. Remember what I said earlier about not conflating the IRA with sectarianism? Yes, this is the reason why. Another reason was that Adams and his supporters wanted to make the party more of a left-wing political movement. Remember, this was the 1970s when left-wing revolutionary groups like the Red Army faction in West Germany, the Red Brigade in Italy, and Direct Action in France had been extremely active, as well as the left-wing Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO. Therefore, having Sinn Féin more of a left-wing organization would fit with the times. And finally, many looked at Adams as the passing of the torch, as many within Sinn Féin were getting up there in years. Now, there is one thing that I want to bring up here, which was the Sunningdale Agreement, a failed power-sharing agreement between the UK and Ireland in 1973 and 1974, which was mostly opposed by the Unionists led by Ian Paisley. I'm only bringing this up here because someone might mention it in the comments that it was missed, but when talking about the evolution of Sinn Féin, it really didn't have an impact whatsoever. However, there was another issue brewing on the horizon: abstentionism. According to Sinn Féin policy, those who won local elections in the Republic of Ireland were allowed to serve. However, those contesting local elections in the North were not allowed to serve. During the 1978 Ardèche, a motion was put forward to allow those in the North to also serve their constituencies. O'Brady and many of the delegates that were from the South denounced the motion, while many of those in the North mostly supported it. However, some exceptions from the North were Danny Morrison and Gerry Adams, as they felt that Sinn Féin wasn't ready to start contesting elections. This debate, though, did show the North-South cracks within the political party. A year later, in 1979, Sinn Féin decided not to contest the first European Parliament elections. As a result, Bernadette Devlin ran as an independent Republican and taking 5.9% of the vote in Northern Ireland. She was able to use her platform to promote civil rights and the rights of political prisoners in Northern Ireland. Devlin's vote showed Republicans that there were a number of voters in Northern Ireland who supported the Republican cause and were looking to alternatives to the nationalist SDLP. But in 1980, there was another issue that occupied the news, and that was the treatment of prisoners at the Maze prison. After the release of Republican prisoners in 1975, the British government stated that anyone who was arrested from March 1976 onward would not be considered a political prisoner, but a criminal. To protest this treatment, Republican prisoners went on a blanket and no-wash strike where their cells were covered in human waste. However, with this approach not yielding any results, 7 prisoners went on a hunger strike on October 27, 1980, but that was eventually called off. A few months later, on March 1, 1981, Republican prisoner Bobby Sands, who was serving a 14-year sentence for weapon possession, started yet another hunger strike. Only 4 days after Sands started his hunger strike, Frank Maguire, one of the Republican MPs who had been elected in 1974, passed away. Sands was nearly immediately considered by Sinn Féin to be the candidate for the upcoming by-election, though they were cautious. A win for Sands could mean more attention given to the prisoners. A loss could harm the Republican cause, especially since the seat was held by a Republican. The Sinn Féin leadership was split when it came to putting Sands' name forward, but they eventually supported the idea. But one thing helped Sands' campaign, and that was the SDLP not fielding a candidate, as they were worried about a backlash if they were blamed for the causing of the defeat of a hunger striker. Still, to play it safe, Sinn Féin didn't connect their party's name to Bobby Sands and instead used the name Anti-H Block as his party's name. H Block was the name of the prison facilities at Maze Prison because they were shaped like the letter H. For those involved with Sinn Féin in Northern Ireland, this was a new experience. Since Bloody Sunday, most of the members of Sinn Féin were more than likely to be involved with paramilitary activities than electoral politics. Another issue was that the constituency was Fermanagh in South Tyrone, but most involved with Sinn Féin came from Belfast and didn't know the area. Sinn Féin supporters were able to work with Frank Maguire's supporters who did know the politics of the region. And while this was a baptism by fire, it was also a great learning experience for the eventual electoral success that Sinn Féin would encounter over the coming decades. On April 9, 1981, Bobby Sands was elected to Westminster. With 87% voter turnout, Sands won 51.2% of the vote. Sands would die on May 5, 1981, which led to another by-election. His campaign manager, Owen Caron, ran for the seat as Parliament changed the rules to not allow prisoners to run for Parliament. He would win the by-election with 49.1% of the vote in August, again running under the anti-H Block ticket. Once elected, Caron would become a member of Sinn Féin and would abstain from holding a seat in Westminster. Between those elections, another general election was being held in the Republic of Ireland. Using the same electoral strategy for using political prisoners on hunger strikes as candidates, Kieran Doherty and Paddy Agnew would be elected to the Dáil. Doherty would later die in August, As for Agnew, he abstained from taking a seat in Dublin, which was Sinn Féin policy at the time. But he couldn't take a seat anyway because he was a prisoner in Northern Ireland and not the Republic. With the electoral success in the North, the 1981 Ardèche debated the issue of contesting local elections in the North. Previously, Adams and others in the North opposed contesting these elections because Sinn Féin wasn't quite ready. But with these wins, it showed that electoral success was possible for the Republican cause. A motion was passed to allow those under the Sinn Féin banner to contest and take their seats in Northern Irish local elections. They also expanded their electoral commitment, allowing those under the Sinn Féin banner to run in the South, as well as the new Northern Irish Assembly, though members would not take their seats. However, O'Brady warned against this and worried that going headfirst into the political process was too risky. But the party essentially ignored his warning. Still, O'Brady, who was trying to show that he was more than just an IRA man, worked with Dáil O'Connell to create a governmental framework called New Ireland, which was adopted as official Sinn Féin policy in the 1970s. The idea was that a united Ireland would have a four-province federal model. But Gerry Adams shot this idea down, as the Ulster province would always elect a loyalist government. The 1981 Ardèche voted to remove the New Ireland approach from its platform. Even though he was still president, O'Brady's influence in the party essentially dwindled to nothing. However, the Irish general election on February 18th of 1982 was an electoral disaster. Sinn Féin, running for the first time in the South since 1961, only won 1% of the vote. Those within the party thought that the electoral success less than a year earlier would have built momentum. But with the hunger strikes over, Sinn Féin just slipped back into being a fringe abstentionist party in the South. After the loss, Danny Morrison said that there were those who had sympathy for the Republican cause as well as sympathy for abstentionism, but at the same time considered Leinster House, the place where the Dáil sits, as their legitimate government. It was at this point that Morrison, as well as others, had to accept that abstentionism was a hindrance to electoral success, at least in the Republic of Ireland. Also, while some had sympathy for the Republican cause, it was too specific of a policy that didn't appeal to a broad swath of the electorate. Essentially, they needed to make a bigger tent. Sinn Féin was talking about republicanism, the British government, and abstentionism, and the voters were talking about jobs, the economy, and inflation and prices. There was also another election in 1982, which was for the Northern Irish Assembly. In this election, Sinn Féin won 10.1% of the vote, making them the fourth largest party, with Gerry Adams, Owen Caron, Martin McGuinness, Danny Morrison, and Jim McAllister winning seats. However, all members would abstain from taking those seats. This election further confirmed that there was an electoral appetite for British withdrawal in Northern Ireland. Unlike the South, where the issue of the British didn't play a role in electoral politics, it continued to do so in the North. This result further bolstered the Adams camp within Sinn Féin, who advocated increased electoral participation. Sinn Féin would take an even bigger step on June 9, 1983 during the UK general election, as Gerry Adams won a seat in Westminster in the constituency of Belfast West. This was the first time that a member of Sinn Féin won a seat in the British Parliament since 1918, and the first time since partition. And of course, Adams didn't take his seat. Danny Morrison almost won in Mid-Ulster, but lost by only 87 votes. A few months later, at the 1983 Ardèche on November 12th, Gerry Adams was elected president of Sinn Féin, stressing that the party needed to move itself from political isolation. This would also move the party's political heart from Dublin to Belfast. The Ardèche also voted to allow those who were elected to the European Parliament to take their seats. But a few months after the Ardèche, there was an assassination attempt on Adams on March 14, 1984. Adams was hit 5 times, but would make a speedy recovery. Now, before we continue, I just briefly want to mention the Anglo-Irish Agreement, which was another failed power-sharing agreement between the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland. Sinn Féin actually opposed this agreement, with many in the IRA seeing the agreement as a result of their recent paramilitary campaign activity in the north. They also opposed it because it, again legitimized British rule in Ireland. However, it was not something that impacted Sinn Féin as a political entity itself, but I did want to mention it. While things looked positive in the north, with the exception of the party's leader being shot, the party still needed to address the issue in the south. To many in the party, the issue of abstentionism was their biggest roadblock to electoral success. Therefore, there needed to be a change in direction with the changing times, with Martin McGuinness calling this the era of pragmatism. Over the course of the next year, Adams was able to solidify support for removing abstentionism from Leinster House, with political prisoners and diehard IRA supporters supporting the proposed change. The biggest endorsement came in October of 1986 when the IRA publicly supporting removing abstentionism for those elected to Leinster House. Still, O'Brady and his supporters were strongly opposed to removing abstentionism and threatened to leave the party. But whether O'Brady left the party or not really didn't matter, as his influence within Sinn Féin had been waning since the early electoral successes of 1981. This brings us to the 1986 Ardèche, where the issue of abstentionism to Leinster House would be debated, as well as the last epic battle between Adams and O'Brady. In order for abstentionism to be removed, the Ardèche needed to have a vote of 2/3 in favor of the motion. Both men, as well as a number of high-ranking Republicans, gave impassioned speeches supporting and opposing the motion. O'Brady spoke about the history of Sinn Féin and how this motion would reject the principles of the party. Martin McGuinness, who supported the motion, brought up how O'Brady was duped by the British in 1975 and that his time as leader should be finished. As author Kevin Rafter said, quote, McGuinness was clearly signaling that the fault lines within the Republican movement went well beyond the immediate matter of amending the abstentionist policy, end of quote. After the debate, the vote came. As the vote was being counted, which was done by a show of hands, O'Brady made his way toward the back door and sat down. Once the vote was called and 429 of the 628 voting members voted for the Adams-backed proposal, O'Brady slipped out the back door, followed by less than 100 members of his group. After leaving the Ardèche, O'Brady started a new political party called Republican Sinn Féin, which still operates today and holds one seat in the Galway County Council. However, because the party is extremely weak, it actually doesn't contest local elections and just runs candidates as independents. The paramilitary wing of Republican Sinn Féin is the Continuity IRA. Now, there is a debate as to who are the truly legitimate heirs of the Sinn Féin that was formed in 1905. If we want to look at Arthur Griffith's original argument, which was primarily argued on abstentionism, then Republican Sinn Féin are the true heirs of the original party. However, this is only based on ideology. If we want to look at the votes and the splits in the party since the early 1900s, then the Provisional Sinn Féin, which we will now just simply refer to as Sinn Féin, is the true legitimate heir. Political parties change ideologies, and Sinn Féin wasn't any different. But this change brought us into the modern era of Sinn Féin and our final chapter. Since 1986, there haven't been any significant splits from Sinn Féin. Therefore, I'm not really going to focus on any more party splits, with the exception of a brief mention of the 32 County Sovereignty Association in 1987. From this point forward, most of what we talk about is the success of Sinn Féin after the 1986 Ardèche. Now, one can say that 1986 was the beginning of a transition point for Sinn Féin. Prior to 1986, almost all of their candidates were either members of the IRA or political prisoners who were also probably members of the IRA. But professionalizing the party required Sinn Féin to start looking outside IRA circles and recruit candidates that were purely interested in the political process. This meant that many of their early candidates didn't have any political experience. In fact, many of the candidates who ran in the 1980s on both sides of Ireland were usually Sinn Féin volunteers that were unemployed. The way that many made a living by working for Sinn Féin is that they received unemployment benefits while receiving money from Sinn Féin to compensate for any lost income from being unemployed. And once many of those people were known as active members of Sinn Féin, they essentially became unemployable because of Sinn Féin's connection to the IRA. The main goal early on was to build connections to their communities, and as those connections built up, the party would gain support. On top of that, the party started to recruit people who had sympathies for the Republican cause, but were in no way associated with the IRA, thus creating a separation between the two. However, even though there was separation, to be a member of Sinn Féin, one must believe in the objectives of the IRA. As Angus O'Snoddick said, quote, "I never opposed the IRA. I canvassed on doorsteps where I was asked about the IRA and I would have to defend it." End of quote. He also knew that any attacks by the IRA would bring heat on him since he was one of the public faces of Sinn Féin. Whenever there was an attack, he said, quote, "You would go, oh fuck, again, how am I going to defend this?" End of quote. The first test for the newly politically focused Sinn Féin was the 1987 Irish general election. One of the problems for Sinn Féin was access to the airwaves. In 1960, the Irish government passed Section 31, a law that allowed censorship on government-run media for those who advocated violence, of which they included Sinn Féin because of their connections to the IRA. The ban made it hard for Sinn Féin to use the airwaves to campaign through RTE, the Republic of Ireland's primary channel. However, they were able to use independent media and, ironically, the British television airwaves to get their message out to voters. The censorship was eventually dropped in 1994. With that, Sinn Féin had another horrible Irish election in 1987, only winning 2% of the vote and no seats, with 24 of their 27 candidates losing their deposits. Their strongest support was from the counties that bordered the north and within Dublin itself, with the party winning 5% in central Dublin. The next Irish general election in 1989 saw Sinn Féin doing worse. They only fielded 14 candidates, with 12 losing their deposits. Their first preference vote share dropped to 1.2%, meaning 98.8% of voters in the Irish Republic preferred another party. 1992 wasn't much better, with the party only winning 1.6% of the vote and not picking up any seats in the Dáil. There were a number of problems for Sinn Féin when it came to their poor electoral performances in the Irish Republic. First, the party wasn't talking about bread and butter issues and seemed to focus all of their attention on British occupation in Northern Ireland. The second was that Sinn Féin still had a strong connection to the IRA, which had been deemed responsible for 34 deaths in 1992 alone. This was the exact problem that Danny Morrison pointed out 10 years earlier. Yes, removing abstentionism meant that Sinn Féin members could represent a constituency, but represent them on what? A conflict that was happening hundreds of miles away? The party still hadn't changed to a mainstream political party yet. Which brings us to another problem, which is that Ireland at the time was considered a center-right country. Sinn Féin's far-left revolutionary ideology was considered on the far fringes of politics in the Republic of Ireland, thus had very little appeal. What also made it harder was that the Workers' Party, remember the party who voted to sit in the Dáil in 1970, which led to the creation of the Provisionals in the first place, they had already established themselves as the far-left party, which made it harder for Sinn Féin now. And finally, Sinn Féin had truly become a Northern Irish party after the 1986 Ardèche. Most who lived in the South had been connected to Republican Sinn Féin. Yes, Sinn Féin wanted to compete in the South, but they still had a Northern focus to their organization. Now, let's flip over to the elections in Northern Ireland. After the 1986 Ardèche, there were a number of significant attacks carried out by the Provisional IRA. The most known of these attacks was the Remembrance Day ceremony in Enniskillen on November 8, 1987, which killed 10 civilians. Between 1986 and 1994, both the IRA and Loyalist paramilitary organizations were involved with tit-for-tat killings. and when it came to the elections, the results showed that people weren't supportive of Sinn Féin. In the first Northern Irish local elections in 1989, Sinn Féin lost 0.8% of the popular vote and 16 council seats. The 1987 UK general election saw Sinn Féin drop by 1.9% to 11.5% of the total vote in Northern Ireland. In the next general election, which was 1992, Sinn Féin dropped another 1.5% and Adams lost his seat in Belfast West, which was considered an electoral shock. This means that Sinn Féin no longer had any elected MPs from Northern Ireland. In the local elections in 1993, Sinn Féin slightly improved by 1.1% and picked up 8 seats as well. Still, the party was still considered a fringe and far from being electorally successful. But things were about to change, and this is where we really need to intertwine the IRA and Sinn Féin activities. While Sinn Féin was trying to market itself as a political entity that supported the goals of the IRA Army Council was still at the top of the pyramid when it came to the direction of the movement, politically and regarding the arms struggle. According to author Ed Maloney, Gerry Adams was not just the leader of Sinn Féin, but a member of the IRA's 7-member Army Council, something that Adams had always denied. Another member of the Army Council was Martin McGuinness, who was instrumental in arguing for a shift toward electoral politics at the 1986 Ardèche. McGuinness always said that he wasn't a member of the IRA, at least until 2001, when he gave testimony to the inquiry looking into Bloody Sunday in 1972, where he indeed stated that he was the IRA's second-in-command in Derry on January 30th, 1972. Honestly, this was one of the worst-kept secrets of the Troubles, but it was now official and on the record. But McGuinness was important here because he had a strong connection to the rank and file in the active service units of the IRA. Also, he was more respected than Adams by many IRA members because he did have an operational history in the IRA, while Adams was seen as purely political. But in 1992, Sinn Féin was starting to show that they were purely on the path to peace. In their 1992 Ardèche, they released a document called Towards a Lasting Peace in Ireland, which basically supported Republican values, but also hinted that the party could move toward peace. I've linked it down below in the description, and Maloney's book also does a good job of explaining the impact of this document, which I will link down below as well. Essentially, the document was used to soften up the Republican movement, with Adams and McGuinness moving the party towards political means. On December 15, 1993, the Downing Street Declaration was introduced, which set out a plan that stated that people of Ireland had the right to self-determination, that reunification of Ireland was possible through a referendum, and that the people of Ireland exclusively could solve their issues. Essentially, what this meant was that the British would lessen influence in Northern Ireland. But there was also an olive branch, which stated that parties linked to paramilitary groups like Sinn Féin could participate in the negotiations as long as they no longer sought violent means to their ends. There were debates within the IRA Army Council as to whether they should accept the declaration or not, and IRA attacks continued. But in late August 1994, the Army Council met and voted to declare a ceasefire, which they announced on August 31st. As a result, Sinn Féin could participate in the talks between the Irish and British governments on the future of Ireland. In addition, loyalist paramilitary organizations also called a ceasefire so that they could be represented through their political organizations. But things weren't as rosy for Sinn Féin as one might expect. Unionist parties that sat at Westminster pressured Prime Minister John Major to require Sinn Féin to disarm before being allowed into any negotiations. Major agreed and stated that Sinn Féin would not be accepted until the disarmament of the IRA was confirmed. Interestingly, the loyalist paramilitary organizations were not forced to disarm, but their political entities were still allowed to be part of the negotiation process laid out by the Downing Street Declaration. Throughout 1995, the disagreements between Sinn Féin and the British government continued. Even with the visit of Bill Clinton to Belfast, as well as a meeting with Gerry Adams, Major still wouldn't let Sinn Féin be involved with any of the process until the IRA was disarmed. From this point on, the negotiations would spiral into freefall, and the IRA ended their ceasefire on February 9, 1996, with the Docklands bombing in London, which killed 2 people and caused £150 million in damage. A few months later, in April of 1996, the Northern Ireland Act was passed, which set up a body in Northern Ireland known as the Northern Ireland Forum that would consist of the people who would be part of future negotiations, as well as some devolved powers to Northern Ireland. Even though Sinn Féin won 15.5% of the vote and 15 seats, they were not allowed to take their seats because of breaking the ceasefire. The SDLP, which won 21.4% of the vote and 19 seats, abstained from the forum. Throughout the rest of 1996, Sinn Féin would not be part of any talks, including the ones headed by former US Senator George Mitchell, which started in July. But things were about to change yet again in 1997. The UK general election on May 1st saw an electoral landslide for Labour, bringing in Tony Blair as Prime Minister. In that same election, Sinn Féin won 16.1% of the vote, now making it the 3rd most popular party, moving ahead of the Democratic Unionist Party. They also gained another seat in Westminster, with both Adams and McGuinness being elected. Of course, they abstained. Since a new Prime Minister was no longer needing to placate Unionist MPs, Blair said that Sinn Féin could enter the negotiations as long as they declared a ceasefire without the precondition of disarmament. A few months later, on July 19th, the IRA declared another ceasefire, but the Blair government wanted to make sure that it was serious. After a probationary period in which the IRA didn't conduct any attacks, the Blair government allowed Sinn Féin into the all-party talks on September 9, 1997. Now, if you remember at the beginning of this chapter, I mentioned a 32-county sovereignty movement. Well, that was from another split in Sinn Féin and the IRA regarding the ceasefire in 1997. They were opposed to the ceasefire and wanted to continue the armed struggle. The leaders of this group were Michael McKevitt, a former member of the IRA Army Council, and his wife Bernadette Sands McKevitt, the sister of Bobby Sands. The paramilitary arm of the organization was called the Real IRA, a group mostly known for the brutal bombing in Omagh on August 15, 1998. They have had one member of the Derry City Council elected, Gary Donnelly, who has had many run-ins with the law. And with that, let's get back to Sinn Féin. Now, I can keep you on the hook for a while, but I won't. After the IRA announced its ceasefire on July 19, 1997, it never broke that ceasefire. I think that it's important to say that here for 2 reasons. First, this makes Sinn Féin, not the Provisional Irish Republican Army, the top of the pyramid now, which means Sinn Féin dictates the movement going forward. The second thing is that this will allow Sinn Féin to gradually move away from the history of the IRA with each passing election. In the 1997 Irish general election, which happens to be before the new ceasefire, Sinn Féin improved to 2.5% of the vote and gained 1 seat. 2 years later, in 1999, Sinn Féin would continue to improve in the Republic, winning 3.5% of the vote in the local elections and gaining 13 seats, the second most of any party. On the same day, the European Union elections were held, with Sinn Féin jumping to 6.3% support, but not gaining any seats. Still, Sinn Féin basically doubled their totals from the previous election. The 2002 Irish general election saw even more gains for Sinn Féin, winning 6.5% of the vote and 5 seats in Leinster House. In 2004, Sinn Féin continued to improve, winning an extra 63 seats in local elections and 1 seat in the European Parliament, with Mary Lou McDonald now representing the party in Europe. But north of the border, the Good Friday Agreement was signed on April 10, 1998. In the agreement, a power-sharing government was formed, as well as new cross-border institutions with the Republic of Ireland, as well as opening the border between the 2 parts of Ireland. There was also an agreement that issues would be solved through democratic and peaceful means, and that any Irish reunification effort would be done through a referendum of a majority throughout the island. There was also a process to release political prisoners and to start the weapons decommissioning of paramilitary organizations. This would later be considered the historical end of the Troubles. The first election to be held after the Good Friday Agreement was the first election to Stormont, or the Legislative Assembly in Northern Ireland. Sinn Féin finished with 16.7% of the vote and 18 seats, which wasn't far off from the first place SDLP with 22% of the votes and 24 seats. While not in control of Stormont, this showed that Sinn Féin was reaping the benefits of moving toward a peaceful solution in Ireland. In the 2001 UK election, Sinn Féin continued to improve, winning 21.7% of the vote, making it the largest nationalist or Republican party in Northern Ireland, surpassing the SDLP. They also gained 2 seats, with Michelle Gildernew from Fermanagh, South Tyrone, and Pat Doherty from West Tyrone joining Adams and McGuinness. The second election to Stormont in 2003 saw Sinn Féin rise yet again, winning 6 more seats and 23.5% of the vote, surpassing the Ulster Unionists as the second largest party, with the Democratic Unionists jumping into first. Now, the reason I've been going through these elections quickly is that there isn't much to talk about regarding these elections specifically. Sinn Féin was now just another political party, though it still had the IRA hanging around its neck. When it came to the issues, they started focusing more on bread and butter issues from a leftist perspective, though they did still talk about Irish reunification. But in 2005, there would be some major shifts. In the 2005 UK general election, which was on May 5th, Sinn Féin would increase both their seat and vote totals, officially becoming the second largest party in Northern Ireland. In the local elections, held on the same day, the same held true, with Sinn Féin now being second in both the vote totals and seats won. But on July 28, 2005, nearly 8 years after they declared their ceasefire, the IRA officially ended its armed campaign, ordering all units to turn in their arms for decommissioning. In September, the Independent International Commission on Decommissioning declared that the Provisional Irish Republican Army had fully decommissioned its arsenal. While not done formally, many consider this the official disbanding of the Provisional Irish Republican Army. As a result, Sinn Féin was now purely a political organization. Yes, it still had the history and the people who were involved with the Troubles, but throughout the last decade, many new people who were strongly Republican but had no connection to the armed conflict became highly involved with the party. In the next Stormont election in 2007, Sinn Féin continued to climb, with 26.2% of the vote and 28 seats, a gain of 4. But it was the 2010 UK general election that was historic. While Sinn Féin didn't gain any new seats at Westminster, the party won 25.5% of the vote, giving it the plurality of vote in Northern Ireland, with the DUP a half a percentage behind. But in the next Stormont election in 2011, Sinn Féin would finish second, 3.1% behind the DUP, but significantly ahead of all other parties. Therefore, Sinn Féin firmly planted itself as the second most popular party in Northern Ireland. While the party had been improving quickly in Northern Ireland, the same couldn't be said in the Republic. Yes, the party had made some improvements, but not anything that was seismic like what was happening in the North. After winning his seat in Westminster, which he abstained from anyway, Adams resigned from the House of Commons, which seems weird because he wasn't actually in the House of Commons, to run in Louth in the 2011 Irish general election. Sinn Féin gained 3% on their previous popular vote total and elected 10 new members to Leinster House, including Adams. Over the next few election cycles, both Gerry Adams and Mary Lou McDonald would focus on improving the party's standing in the Republic of Ireland, again focusing on bread and butter issues. Also, while reunification was still a goal, the party made specific North and South messages instead of just one big united Irish message. In the 2014 local elections in the Republic, Sinn Féin gained 7.8%, winning 15.2% of the vote and gaining 105 seats, the largest of any party in that election. As far as the North, there wasn't much going on. The 2015 UK general election didn't see much of a change, though Sinn Féin did lose one seat. The local elections weren't that impressive for any major party, as minor candidates were starting to win, and the same can be said for the 2016 Stormont elections, with all 5 major parties losing votes. But just a year later, the DUP was involved in a renewable heat incentive scandal, which would take a lot of time to explain. Anyway, Martin McGuinness asked for a new election to be called, which was done for March 2nd, 2017. While Sinn Féin would gain 3.9% of the vote from their 2016 total, they actually lost 1 seat. Still, the DUP lost 10 seats. Even though McGuinness was the leader of the party in the last election, he died of cancer just 3 weeks after the 2017 election. Michelle O'Neill took McGuinness's place as the party's Northern Ireland leader and is still leader today. On February 10, 2018, Gerry Adams stepped down as president of Sinn Féin. With the death of Martin McGuinness a year earlier, this represented a change of the guard. Mary Lou McDonald now became president of Sinn Féin, with Michelle O'Neill becoming the vice president. Of course, this also represented a generational change. MacDonald was born in 1969 and O'Neill in 1977, which meant that the party was cutting off all ties to its IRA past. Now it was simply just part of its history. At first, the party had some growing pains. In the North, Sinn Féin seemed to be dropping without Adams. Also, not only did the leaders of the party change, but so did many who had been involved as well. Much of the institutional political knowledge of Sinn Féin was dying off, and this new generation almost had to start from the beginning. During the 2019 UK general election, Sinn Féin lost 6.7% of the vote, but didn't lose any seats. But in 2022, Sinn Féin's fortunes would change, not necessarily because they improved, but their rivals were falling. First, the scandal involving the DUP I mentioned earlier started to hurt the party significantly. Many of those who had voted for the DUP in the past started going to unionist alternatives or to the Alliance Party, a political party focused more on good governance, which stays out of the sectarian and unification debates. Another reason the DUP fell was their strong support for Brexit. In the 2022 Stormont elections, Sinn Féin became the largest party in both seats and votes, winning 27 seats with 29% of the vote. But interestingly, that was only a 1.1% increase in popular support, and the seat total was exactly the same as the last election. It was the DUP under Jeffrey Donaldson that lost 6.7% of the vote and 3 seats. Now, there is a whole power sharing debacle which happens that wouldn't be solved until 2024, but that's another subject altogether. 1 year later, the Northern Ireland local election saw a big swing towards Sinn Féin. The party gained 7.7% compared to the last local elections, winning 30.9% of the vote and gaining 39 seats. The DUP didn't lose any seats and only lost 0.8% of the vote. Most of Sinn Féin's gains were from the collapse of the SDLP, as well as the electorate simply becoming more Republican. But it was the UK general election in 2024 that saw Sinn Féin become the largest party in Northern Ireland at Westminster. But the main reason for the rise was because of the downfall of the DUP. On March 28, 2024, just a little over 3 months before the election, DUP leader Jeffrey Donaldson and his wife were arrested for a number of horrific sexual abuse charges. Donaldson resigned as party leader the next day, and the case is still in courts at the time of this recording. With that and other scandals that happened with the DUP, many former DUP voters jumped over to Jim Allister, a hard right-wing unionist and founder of the traditional Unionist Voice Party, which is now connected to Nigel Farage's UK Reform Party. In the election, Sinn Féin won 27% of the vote to the DUP's 22.1%, now led by Gavin Robinson, no relation to the former DUP leader Peter Robinson. Sinn Féin didn't gain any seats, but the DUP lost 3. Jim Allister won a seat, as well as the Ulster Unionist Party, and that's where everything stands today in Northern Ireland. As far as the Republic of Ireland, Sinn Féin had mixed results. In the 2019 local elections, Sinn Féin lost 78 seats and over a third of its vote, losing 5.7% and finishing with 9.5%. The reason for this loss was probably due to other parties saying that it would not work with Sinn Féin on local councils or in any power-sharing agreement, thus making it useless to vote for Sinn Féin. However, that tactic did not work in the 2020 general election. Sinn Féin became the most popular party in the Republic, winning 24.5% of the vote, 2.3% more than the second-place Fianna Fáil. But because of the vote distribution, Fianna Fáil would win one more seat than Sinn Féin. But like with the AfD in Germany, the other party said that they wouldn't form government with Sinn Féin because of their IRA past. Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, and the Green Party formed a coalition government, which saw a split Taoiseach. When the 2024 elections came, Sinn Féin looked as if it could win the most seats in Leinster House. Polls in the middle of 2022 show Sinn Féin with support in the mid to high 30s, with other parties being in the low 20s at best. But that lead would eventually come crashing down. First, immigration became a more salient issue in Ireland. Sinn Féin were on the left when it came to immigration, but most of the population was shifting to the right and calling for a reduction of immigrants in Ireland. The party had been campaigning on housing affordability, but immigration started to be dominant. But it wasn't just that. Sinn Féin had their own sex scandal. Michael McMonagle, the party's former press officer, pled guilty to 14 counts of soliciting sex with minors. Obviously, this was a major problem, but it became a bigger one when it was suggested that people within the party knew about these problems, and then even gave him a positive work reference after he had already pled guilty to those charges. As a result, Sinn Féin only won 19% of the vote, finishing third place. They did gain 2 seats, but that was mostly because the size of the Dáil was increased. And with that, we've come to the end of the video. While this was a long video, it doesn't explain everything with Sinn Féin. There's a lot more that could be discussed, but that would require an entire channel on its own. But I hope that you left this video knowing a little bit more about the history of Sinn Féin more than you did before you started watching it. And with that, I want to thank you all very much for watching. I will see you in the next video. Bye for now.